Good morning and welcome to the 2020 PNPW Pretreatment Workshop. My name is Patrick Bryan and I'll be your moderator for this morning. Just a few housekeeping before we get started. Make sure that you answer and respond to all the questions and all the polls throughout the presentation. This is how we tabulate and keep track of those that are present so that you can receive your CEUs.
Hey, Patrick?
Yes.
I am sorry to interrupt, but I realized I got pulled away on emergency yesterday and never got those polls entered. So I think we'll have to have people just raise their hand when a poll should come, and it'll mark that, and we'll count that for today, and I'll get the polls in tonight. My apologies to everybody for that.
Technical difficulties occur. Thanks, Ken. So did you guys hear that? So just raise your hand and we'll use that as your raising your hands as present for the workshop. That way you can receive your CEUs. And let's see, our first speaker today is David James. David is a technical program manager for the Pacific Northwest Pollution Prevention Resource Center, as well as owner of a wastewater training consulting out of Lander, Texas. David is experienced in leading wastewater utilities. David has a bachelor's and a master's degree in civil engineering out of Texas A&M. And David has over 45 years experience in the environmental and pretreatment field. David serves on the Water Environment Federation and the EPA group for fats, oil, and grease. David's hobbies are writing and performing music. So we got a musician. So today I'd like to welcome our first presenter, David James.
All right.
You're up, amigo.
Okie doke. So we'll switch the screen over to me. Yeah, thanks, Patrick, for that introduction. Yeah, I've got the gray hair to prove I've been doing this stuff for 45 years. So it's good to be with everybody today.
There we go.
Okay, let's see.
I see your home screen there.
Okay.
There's your presentation. Marvelous.
And just so you know, David, I'll never say anything about gray hair.
I appreciate that, kid.
Hey,
So I need to switch display settings, or?
Yeah, switch it over. Swap. That's it. Let's see. All right. I see you and I see your presentation.
Oh, no, I don't see my presentation. We'll get it right here in a minute.
We see it.
Uh-oh.
Are you on two monitors?
Oh, yeah. Okay, here we go. Let me slide this around.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm technology limited when it comes to computers and everything. So can y'all see the full screen of the presentation now?
I see both of us at the top, and then your presentation is right down below.
Okay, good deal.
All right.
All right. Yeah, well, like I said, I appreciate the opportunity to present to you guys today. This is my first time attending, even though just virtually, the Pacific Northwest Pretreatment Workshop, and I've been really impressed with the speakers and the agenda that was put together. You know, having switched from from planning on doing it live to now having to do it virtually. And I know I've been involved with the Region 6 EPA pretreatment conferences for 20 plus years. And the last 2 years we decided not to do anything virtual or whatever. And then plus I retired from the TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, after 26 years working with pretreatment and pollution prevention projects. So it's nice to be getting back into into being able to do some presentations and share some of the knowledge that I've gained over the years with you folks, and I hope you find it useful. I know last week, Al, in his presentation, he was talking about auditing, and so I'm going to be talking about auditing too this morning. Slightly different perspective, and hopefully some stories that you'll enjoy. So in the picture you're looking at, circa 1920s, you know, we've come a long way. I know I started, basically, I didn't realize it was pretreatment, but I used to work for the San Antonio Water Board back in the early 70s. My dad was the assistant training director, and so he was bringing in training and things like that. And I was able to get a job with them working during the summers as a laboratory technician, and that was like 100 MGD plant. It was a big plant called the Rilling Road plant. It's been replaced since, but I remember, you know, working in a lab, and all of a sudden we'd start getting some really, really different lab results from some of the testing and things that we were doing, like with metals, you know, and the normal BOD, TSS, our DOs, our process control testing. And so we started asking ourselves the questions like, what in the world is going on? Because we figured out it wasn't operational. The people were doing what they needed to do. So there must have been something coming into the plant. And so, you know, the pretreatment regulations didn't really hit till like 1978. So we were kind of going, So we started looking into the sewer system, trying to figure out if some people were discharging stuff down to us to cause us some problems at the plant. And so that was kind of like my introduction to pretreatment before it was in vogue, before the regs were actually promulgated. And interestingly enough, you know, before Christ, in the BC era, some of the civilizations recognized the need to separate water from wastewater. I don't know that they really understood what was going on, but if those two were somehow, you know, the wastewater would contaminate the drinking water, and then people would start getting sick. So for some reason, they were able to recognize the difference, which kind of brings me to one of the things I wanted to share is that if you've never been to this site, sewerhistory.org, for all you wastewater dweebs, excuse that expression, it's definitely worth your while to go there. There's like this whole history of wastewater treatment, all these pictures and things like the one that's on the screen right now, that if you're really into wastewater, really passionate about that, you'll find it very interesting. So I would encourage you to do that. So we learn things along the way, and so one of the things that we learned was that, you know, wastewater can have a lot of harmful stuff into it, and then our sewer workers started getting sick. And again, this is before the pretreatment regulations. So can you imagine having to wear that type of contraption when you're working around sewers? Almost looks like a pre-astronaut type of work suit. Yep, there we go. So that brings us around to kind of modern day. And last week, for those of you who attended Cynthia Finley's presentation, you know, she showed some pictures about some of the Excuse me. She showed pictures about some of the catastrophes that were occurring in our waterways and our rivers. You know, like rivers on fire. I know in Texas we had the Trinity River that was called the Red River because it ran through the Fort Worth area, and that was a big stockyard, and so a lot of the slaughtering. I know this may sound gross, but you know, it was basically the blood flowed into the river, and it became a Red River. And we actually have a Red River that's not red in the northern part of the state. So those kinds of things started getting our regulators to, you know, passing laws. And like I was saying, like in 1978 was when the first, I guess, official pretreatment regulations were promulgated under the Clean Water Act. And then in 2005, we had the streamlining regulations. And I'm still wondering why they called it streamlining, but maybe we shouldn't get into that. It was quite an ordeal to go through that rulemaking process. And then we have our Effluent Guidelines that, you know, deal with the categorical industrial users that have been promulgated for all these different industrial sectors, as well as the unconventional extraction of oil and gas industry, and the management standards for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So some other regulations kind of get added along the way, but they're all designed to pretty much do the same thing. You know, once a problem area is defined that's causing some sort of impact, then there's usually some kind of regulation that gets put in place to help address that. And so, you know, this is probably a picture that most, if not all of you have seen, maybe the black and white version or the color version, but this is what it's all about. And I think it goes without saying that those of us who are in this business, the business of wastewater treatment, I don't know how to say it, we're pretty special people. And a lot of times we don't get credit for what we do in order to actually protect the public and the drinking water supplies. And so take a moment to pat yourself on the back, because you know, without us, we'd have a lot more sick people. It was interesting back when wastewater treatment became requirements, like back in the 1800s, when more plants started being built and everything, and then on into the 1920s. I think it was the Department of Vital Statistics in New York that did this big study where they looked at prevention of disease and how it significantly was reduced once we started putting in wastewater treatment plants and everything. And so, even though, like I said, before Christ, some of the civilizations back then recognized there was something going on, they really didn't realize what it was. And so, you know, having the wastewater treatment plants has been really good to help that out. So then the question is, how do we protect those wastewater treatment plants? And that's where, of course, pretreatment comes in. But not everything meets the definition of an industrial user. For example, we may have alligators in our system. Well, pretreatment regs don't really regulate those, although that is a prohibited discharge, I guess, because it's going to impact the flow of wastewater through the system. And of course, we have roots. You know, a lot of cities have actually, or communities have actually gone into rulemaking in terms of their development process to have setbacks on how close to a sewer line on a person's property that you could actually put trees in because of the root problem. And then one of my favorites is, you know, how would you like to be a sewer worker and you put your camera down and you see either an alligator or a raccoon? That would be really interesting. That would scare the dickens out of me. So that brings us to what we're going to do today. We're going to go through and discuss, you know, why we do audits, what it is, purpose, process, And then we're going to go through kind of the preparation of an audit and talk a little bit about some of the different steps that are involved. And most of these have been, basically the 403 regs, 40 CFR Part 403, tells us what a pretreatment program, elements that a pretreatment program has to contain. And so the idea of the audit is to make sure that those elements are being properly implemented. We'll dig a little deeper into that here in a few minutes. So basically, an audit is a comprehensive review of all the elements of the approved pretreatment program. Excuse me. And so how long does an audit take? Well, it's going to depend on a number of factors. Since we've had the COVID situation over the last couple of years, I know there's a number of programs and regions that have gone to remote or virtual audits versus on-site audit. And although I have talked to one program that has gone through that, and they said it was quite a bit different in terms of how they prepared for it and everything. But still, the basic elements of the program were looked at. Depends on the number of wastewater treatment plants that you have, because you have effluent testing and things from each of those plants that get submitted, like in Texas, and it gets submitted through the annual report that the pretreatment programs have to submit to the state, and that kind of information gets reviewed. And that would be like the 126 national priority pollutants, as well as we had like 56 other state water quality standards that would have to be reported on each year. And then the number of significant industrial users or industrial users that are regulated, and then the numbers and types of the multi-jurisdictional agreements. Because if you have like a political subdivision or another city that sends its wastewater to you that has to have the pretreatment program, then they're going to have sources of industrial sources that may have to be regulated as part of your program. So, agreements have to be put in place and that type of thing. And one of the things I thought, that was interesting about looking at audits and pretreatment compliance inspections and self-monitoring and compliance is really is a limited oversight. Think about it. So if we have an audit once every 5 years, that's 1,725 days. So one day out of 1,725, or 1 to 5 days, however long it takes, you got the regulators out doing their audit and looking at how you're doing things. And so it's really just a slice, a very short slice in a long period of time. And if you did the math, that would just be 0.3%, once every 5 years is just 0.3% of that 1,725. And then you look at the control authority responsibilities under the pretreatment regulations. And so you have to do an SIU inspection a few hours at least once per year. So that's 1 day per year. And then you're looking at least, I put at least twice per year. I meant once per year on the compliance monitoring and twice per year on the self-monitoring. So compliance monitoring is just required once per year, although a number of programs will do much more often than that. Some programs will do it even once per month or more often. But anyway, the point being is that there's a lot of things that are going on in between these inspections and monitoring events. And so the idea of having a pretreatment program A good pretreatment program is to make sure that when you're not out there providing oversight, that the industries are doing the right thing, and hopefully doing the right thing the right way to help prevent stuff going down the drains that's going to impact our POTW. And incidentally, when we use the term POTW, publicly owned treatment works, we're not only talking about the wastewater treatment plants, but we're also talking about the collection system and all of its appurtenances, like the manholes, the lift stations, yada yada. So I've been amazed at the number of people that really didn't realize that. So I just thought I'd bring that up just in case you were in that universe of people that hadn't really thought about that. So here we have the basic elements of a pretreatment program that are more or less codified in the 403 regs. So the idea of the audit is to come out and evaluate how the pretreatment program is complying with all these things. And so, when you're required to do a pretreatment program under your wastewater discharge permit, you have to put all these elements in place. And then you have to submit the program and all these elements to the approval authority, the state or EPA, and they will approve it. And so what I've learned over the years is different states still kind of do things out of their way, as well as some of the EPA regions. There's the basic process they go through, but the amount of detail that they spend on their reviews varies. And so one of the things that can happen is, excuse me, is inconsistencies. In other words, there are things that will be in a legal authority that aren't addressed through the SOPs or the permits or whatever. So sometimes there's some disconnects, and so during the audit process, those things will be identified. I'm sorry, apologize. So that brings us to the audit. So kind of the first step is the pre-audit activities, and that's where the state or EPA, depending on who the approval authority is, will prepare for the audit. So they have an idea ahead of time who they're going to audit, and they have to audit, theoretically, they have to audit every pretreatment program once every 5 years, once every permit cycle, which is typically 5 years. And so once they create that list, at least the way we did it in Texas, is then we would look at the annual reports that the pretreatment program submitted, take another look at those, the POTW records, in other words, their compliance monitoring, effluent monitoring data, if there was any enforcement action brought against them. That was kind of interesting too, because some of the enforcement action that we would uncover, like if there was something that happened that the plant passed through an interference, that the POTW would have to submit a document to the agency to talk about why that occurred and what corrective action was taken. And so a lot of times that stuff was actually blamed on the operator. And for those of us with operations experience, we were able to say, now that might have been something that got dumped on them from an industry or whatever. So that would kind of raise a little red flags as we went through the process of preparing. We kind of make notes of that. Then, of course, we'd look at the previous audits and the compliance inspections and make a note of the corrective action that's supposed to be done since the last audit. And typically, the compliance inspection that would occur since the last audit, part of their job was to go through and help make sure that corrective action was actually put in place. But sometimes we find that maybe they overlooked that, they forgot to look at it in enough detail. And so we would just kind of make a note of that as well. And then we'd send out an announcement, different states and regions. Our notice was just 14 days, and I think they've raised it since I retired from them up to like a month. And I think a lot of agencies are doing that. And then we send them this initial interview checklist. And if you've ever gotten that checklist, it can be pretty daunting, pretty scary, because it's a lot of pages and a lot of information that's being requested. And in fact, I remember a couple of the new people that were working some pre-treatment programs, we sent them that initial interview checklist, and I think they almost quit their job. It's like, oh my gosh, I got enough paperwork, and now I got to fill out this stuff. So, it's a pretty daunting task. But the idea behind that is to give those at the state and EPA kind of a snapshot into what you're doing to help make sure your program is adequate and all the necessary things are being addressed. But it should also, I would recommend that you also look at it as an opportunity to identify some things that maybe are missing in the program. You know, staff changes, you know, things just change. And so the way you answer the questions from the last audit to this audit, there may be something different. There may be some additional enforcement action or some additional stuff that's being discharged down to your plant where you've got more enforcement that's taking place. And there's just a whole lot of differences. And so while it's okay to maybe take the initial interview checklist that you did last time and kind of use it to fill in the blanks for the new one, you know, making sure that you're not just copying and pasting and thinking through the questions is really important. And then there may be some additional information that's needed for the auditors to kind of figure out ahead of time what they want to focus on. And for example, whenever they're reviewing the annual reports and the records and stuff, there may be some additional information about certain things that they've seen in the file at EPA or the state that they want to get more information on. So the auditors arrive on site. So typically the first step is to conduct the initial interview. And that can be painstaking depending on how detailed the auditors want to get into it. But some auditors states will actually go through the initial interview almost step by step to kind of verify that the information's correct. And sometimes you know, you kind of, if you do that, you kind of get these looks. It's like, oh my gosh, we've already answered the question. But sometimes you find errors or where somebody didn't provide enough detail. And so it's an opportunity to make sure that what's in the initial interview form is correct. And it's to everybody's advantage because that becomes a document that's part of the file, if you will, in the event that there's some sort of enforcement action or whatever that gets brought against you. It's important to have everything as accurate as possible. And if the files to be reviewed have not been selected already, or maybe they have been selected, and you learn some things through the initial interview where it's like, oh, I think maybe we need to look at this other file. And we want to go visit these sites. And one of the things that we used to always do is sometimes pretreatment program coordinators and staff, you know, you have that one pesky or two pesky industries that they just don't want to cooperate. and they're just pushing back against everything. And so sometimes it's beneficial for a state or EPA regulator, if you will, to walk in and do a site visit to make sure that they fully understand that the reason that you're doing your job is because it's required by law. And so I know we've seen a number of instances where programs were getting pushed back, and just showing up on the site and going through the site visit process, they gained a whole new understanding of what the local program's trying to do. And then we do our file reviews and our site visits, and that we may or may not find some things that we have to start digging deeper into, and you know, finding some of the disconnects. Sometimes we run into situations where an industrial user's been categorized and they don't agree with the categorical determination. So sometimes you'll take a look at how they've been categorized, and then, you know, depending on what your findings are, it may be something that they need to come back and officially request the determination. And there's a process in the 403 regs for doing that. And then if time is available, you know, take a look at the wastewater plants. But sometimes you'll see evidence of some sort of pass-through or interference, or in talking to a couple of the operators, you'll find out that there's maybe some things that have been going on that haven't really been reported to the agency. That's not good, but that also may be like a flag that you want to look deeper into. And so you go through the audit, and you put together your observations, your findings, and then you have this closing meeting or exit meeting. Anyway, at the end of the on-site activity, the audit's not over yet, but you sit down with people and talk about what you found. I've always found that it was extremely important to, you know, there's a lot of good things that programs are doing, and to be able to recognize that and acknowledge that is extremely important. And so we want to talk a little bit about the observations made there. And then there's like areas of concern, or sometimes people will call them deficiencies. Basically, these are things that if they weren't resolved in a very timely manner, they could have become a very serious violation. And then, you know, at the point that you're out there doing the audit, as an auditor, all the violations are alleged, because you've got to go back and sift through the information and help make sure that you have the right findings, and that you have all the details to support the findings, because you've got to stick to the facts. It's not somebody's opinion, it's like a fact. On such and such date, so-and-so didn't do this or that or the other. And as a result, that's a violation of whatever the regulatory citation is that you come up with out of the 403 regs or the program. And then sometimes, like I mentioned, you find some things that are inconsistent between the different pieces of the program, and so that might require some sort of modification. Typically, those would be non-substantial, and sometimes they're substantial modifications. We won't go into the details there, but the 403 regs differentiate the difference between those types of program modifications. If it's a substantial modification, for that to be approved, there has to be permit action, and so that kind of takes this whole process out a while. And then the last two bullets discuss findings and preliminary corrective actions. Those are things that are typically done for the most part during the closing or the exit meeting, because as an auditor or compliance inspector, sometimes you may think you saw certain things and there wasn't something in the files to document that it wasn't done. whatever the finding is, but you find out through this process that, oh, well, we forgot to tell you about this file or that file or whatever. So sometimes these things that appear to be violations are not really, and they can be reconciled on the spot. And of course, the post-site or the post-on-site activities is then the auditors are going to go back, they're going to prepare the report with all the gory details, you know, the findings, the regulatory citations that where there was a failure to implement those, and then the control authority, pretreatment program, has so many days to respond to the audit report and either correct the deficiencies so that finding, so that alleged violation is really no longer a violation, it's been corrected. There's certain types of violations that applies to. However, there's also certain types of violations that if you do those, it's automatic referral to enforcement based on the memos of understanding that the states have with EPA if they've been delegated that program. That gets us into a whole bunch of detail that we don't have time to talk about today. But this is all part of the process. So the reporting of non-compliance, for example, well, let me back up. So EPA and the states have to look at what the violations were, and then there's this form that has to be filled out that goes into this national computer network called ISIS. Now, I don't even remember what that stands for. Anyway, just take my word for it. Anyway, so it goes into ISIS, and basically it's looking at like a pretreatment program is significantly non-compliant if they didn't issue permits to at least 90% of the people they're supposed to, or if they didn't inspect more than 20% of the SIUs over a 12-month period. Or if there's more than 15% that are in SMC, significant non-compliance. So these are all flags that get put down on these documents, and then you know, failure to enforce the pretreatment standards and greater than 15% of the SIUs in SMC. So those are all flags for on the federal level. So, see, I was going to show you the, if you've never seen those checklists, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just, there's the link where you can go and download the document that has all the checklists and everything. And you'll get a copy of this presentation that will be made available to you sometime after the conference is over. So you don't have to worry about writing down the web links. Okay, so that brings us to the last part of the presentations on how do we prepare for an audit. And I've already talked a little bit about this, but I know it's difficult, but try to think of it as an opportunity to improve. I know it's very intimidating to be in the position of a pretreatment program, and you got the state and or the federal folks coming down and taking a look at the program, and especially if they start finding a lot of stuff, it's hard to remain positive because you know you're there to do a good job, and all of a sudden if they start finding stuff and then you're reporting that back to management, sometimes that makes things even more comfortable. So you got to be calm and stay calm as best you can. Provide adequate space. I had to throw that in there because a lot of times we, at some of the programs that we audited, we'd be put in a lunchroom, and it was, we didn't necessarily take lunch at the same time the people were in the lunchroom, so it became an interesting thing. And if the local program told the people they couldn't have lunch there, then all of a sudden we were protecting ourselves as we were leaving the site for the day, because that usually gets people upset. You got to be cooperative. I mean, if you're not, that may or may not be necessarily, you won't be penalized for it, but it makes things easier for everybody when you're cooperative, as cooperative as you can. And then when you get an information request, during the audit, please provide it as quickly as possible. And last but not least, the involvement of all involved in the program implementation. And I don't know how all the other regions do this type of thing across the country. I know that I'm sure it's encouraged, but when you're the pretreatment coordinator and you have some staff that are going through this audit process, not everybody outside of the audit fully appreciates what you're going through. And one of the things that we always wanted, and whether the state and the EPA, whether they request this or just on your own, the more you can get your management involved in the audit process. I know that there's a balance there, but the more they'll appreciate what it is that you and your program are doing. And we've seen time and time again, I've seen time and time again, where there were problems not having the management support. And after going through an audit and the initial interview and stuff like that, it really opened up the supervision, the manager's eyes to where they were going, man, we had no idea what you guys were going through. Now we better understand why we need some additional resources and this and that and the other. And that same thing applies to the multi-jurisdictions. Because a lot of times they're just thinking, it's just a bunch more red tape, there's another regulation we have to comply with, and they don't fully appreciate what the intent is and then what you have to demonstrate to programs. Organized files equals a good audit. Al, I stole this from you. Absolutely. A lot of times we saw things just all over the place. They'd be in file folders here, and they'd be in somebody's computer drive over there, and somebody else's computer drive over in some other place. And so having everything in one place in the industrial user file can be extremely, extremely helpful. It's okay if you don't, but it will help you to stay more organized and make sure you're on top of things, as well as the communication among the departments and multi-jurisdictions. We saw time and time again where the collection system and the wastewater folks didn't really talk. So the collection system people would see something happening out there in the collection system, and they wouldn't communicate that back to the wastewater plant or the pretreatment program. And so everybody's really in this together. The whole idea is to produce an effluent that meets the water quality standards, complies with the permit. And if there's something that's coming down the pipe that's going to cause pass-through interference, we need to know about that. Attention to detail. I think the main point there is that keep in mind that everything that you have has to be legally defensible. So is there enough detail in the write-up to where somebody other than the person that was out there making the observation could read it and understand what happened? I'll just kind of leave it at that. And keep accurate and clear notes. Again, legally defensible. They should be in like the non-disappearing ink, I'll call it. Ink, not pencil. Because if it gets pulled into a court of law, gets subpoenaed or whatever, again, all this stuff needs to be legally defensible. And if it's not, that can either work for you or it can work against you. So Oh yeah, and don't forget, like, I know a lot of people are wanting to go to electronic record keeping, and that is fantastic. That's great. But until you get your Premier compliance and your program allows you to do that, it has to be in your approved program that you have the authority to accept documents electronically signed. So you want to pay close attention to that and talk to your state or EPA if you have questions about what's acceptable and not acceptable. Stick to facts, not opinions. I know I've seen notes. A lot of people's notes was going, man, this guy was a real, you know what, whenever I talked to him on the phone. That's not the kind of thing you want in your notes. You just like, you know, on such day we spoke, it's, you know, with so-and-so, and you said this and you said that. And then whenever you have a phone conversation, have some sort of documentation about that. It can be written, you can follow it up with an email, you know, this is my understanding of our conversation, and then maybe they can email you back that verifies that you had the correct understanding. Here, let's see. So it's important to know your NPDES permit requirements. I would encourage every person that is involved with the, you know, under the pretreatment coordinator that has to go out and do the inspections and things, that they should be familiar with what the permits says. I know it can be kind of boring reading, but I would recommend that. And then understanding the pretreatment program, the legal authority, the industrial user survey, SOP templates and forms. And so a lot of times it's really easy, you know, the old expression, use it or lose it. And so you kind of go on and on and on, and you've been doing certain things a certain way, and then somebody else comes in and they look at it and it's like, that's not how I interpret that. Maybe we should be doing this another way or whatever. So keeping people involved and trying to review this information, and you know, you don't have to be able to recite it, you know, all the verses, so to speak, but it's important to at least understand the you know, the highlights, the deadlines, the days you have to do certain things, the days that the industrial users have to submit stuff. And then along the way, if you find something that is inconsistent between the elements of the pretreatment program, then maybe there's a non-substantial modification that needs to be submitted so you can get that correct. It's not a good idea to, once you have an approved program, to just go out and start changing things without getting the approval of the approval authority. Because if the approval authority in their files, they have one set of SOPs, and then they go out and they do the audit and they find out you're using another set of SOPs that have been approved, that can lead to a problem, sometimes a big problem. Familiarity with the IUs within your system. This is where you need to keep your industrial user survey updated and as up to date as you can. And you have relationships with other departments within the city that's probably providing you some of the information that you've used. And also keep in mind that just because you've done a survey of a certain industrial user, let's say 3 years ago, maybe they've had some kind of change in their process, or they're taking on they have a new wastewater stream that they've added. And so there's been time after time, you know, during the inspections when we go out and we would see that type of thing. And it's like, well, when was the last time that this IU was surveyed? And they hadn't been resurveyed for 5 years. And so again, that can, you know, the idea is to to know what's being discharged by the IUs to see if they need to be regulated. And I'm not suggesting you've got to, there's no rule of thumb on how, I shouldn't say it that way. You have to kind of use your own judgment as to how often that needs to be. But if you're having a program that they're going to be resurveyed every 3 years, then you need to have that documented in your files. Make sure previous violations are corrected. Excuse me, and again, stick to the facts, not opinions. And that kind of leads us to the last part of the presentation, and what to expect. And so what I've done is I've included a number of items that come up during an audit. They may or may not be violations. So in the interest of time, we don't have time to like go through each and every one of these things. But when you get your presentation, you'll be able to come back to this part of the presentation and just think of them as maybe little reminders. You can audit yourself. You can get people in another program. I know, time is always of essence, so that may not be practical. Or getting a person within your own program to maybe do a little mini audit. And these are questions that, periodically maybe you can get together with your staff and ask each other. Is the inventory current? Are they properly regulated? And our control authority staff familiar with pretreatment regulations, program requirements. Oops. Did I go? Yeah, the multi-jurisdictional folks, don't forget about them. Make sure you're investigating all instances of non-compliance and you have that documented. A lot of times, I know we run into situations where if a program finds a non-compliant industrial user, and then they have to publish them for significant non-compliance each year, that they consider that escalated enforcement, and that is not escalated enforcement. So don't fall into your trap. You've got your enforcement response plan and enforcement response guide to refer to, and make sure that you're following those procedures when it comes to enforcement action. Make sure your permits are current, that they've been reissued when they need to be, CIUs correctly categorized, correct pollutant limits have been applied. This can be confusing when you have a categorical industrial user that the end of the process has to, those limits have to be applied to the end of the process, and then the local limits have to be applied at the end of pipe where it discharges into the sewer system. And so that can become really confusing. And especially if you can't measure in the process, if there's no collection point for that, then there's the combined waste stream formula. But there's some caveats that you have to be familiar with before those can be applied, those alternative limits. And then of course, sampling and evaluation for flood discharges, self-monitoring, compliance monitoring, chain of custodies. That's one of the things that will get a lot of people, not necessarily get them in trouble, but you're spending a lot of time and effort to collect these samples. And if you have to go to enforcement and your chain of custodies have not been, are not adequate, they don't contain all the information and everything, the court will throw them out. I've seen that before. So you got to do a good job of reviewing all that information. And if you find out that something in chain of custody isn't correct, you may need to resample. And so the idea is if you're sampling, make sure that you're sampling early enough in the sampling period. Like if you have to sample quarterly, sample early in the quarter so that you have time to resample in case something doesn't come back correct. The instances of POTW pass-through and interference, that's extremely important. You know, when you kind of cut to the chase, that's really what this is all about. We've talked about what I would call paper violations, you know, where the SOP says to do this or do that and you didn't do it. But at the end of the day, what's really important is we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is going to prevent the pass-through and interference, because that's what's going to impact the water quality and cause some problems for folks downstream, the biology in the stream or what have you. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then making sure you're conducting all the activities you're supposed to and doing the right thing the right way. And last but not least, are funding and resources available to adequately implement the program. A lot of times with budget cuts, things will get cut. And again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's important to have management involved to understand what it is that you're having to do and why you're having to do it, so that they can take those things into consideration when it comes budget time and there's pressure to find some dollars out of different people's budgets. So, and that's pretty much the end. Bottom line, teamwork. It takes a team to make all this stuff happen. And Ken, I dedicate this to you, my friend. So that concludes my presentation today. Again, thanks for the opportunity. Oh yeah, and trial and error tomorrow, we're going to go through some typical types of violations and talk about a process to come up with corrective actions. And I've got some pictures and some things to share. So please tune in tomorrow. Thanks.
So a couple things real quick, David. Tomorrow is at 11 o'clock.
Are we gonna do that today?
Yeah, because Angela's gonna take that spot tomorrow. So
that's right. We'll tune in later today.
So we get a double dose of David. And meanwhile, I was able to get those polls in. So before we move any further, let me put this up. And please take this for your CEUs. David James comes to us from Utah, North Carolina, Texas, or the Klingon homeworld.
Do I need to change my screen?
Nope, it's up. I don't think, as a presenter, you won't be able to see it. But it's looking pretty good. We're at about 30 seconds, and I usually give people more than that. About 3/4 have voted, and we're usually up in the 80-something%. So we'll give it about 7, 8 more seconds, and we'll go 5, 4. I don't know if you can see that, David, but the actually Texas wins, but next is 27% for the Klingon homeworld. So thanks to everyone who participated.
Yes.
And I'll hand this back to Patrick.
Hey, thanks, Ken. Hey, Dave, it looks like we had a question come in regarding FT.
See if we could save that for your 11 o'clock session, David, just for the sake of time, since we are running over.
Let's do that.
They asked if you can discuss resource evaluation in terms of FTEs and what the process might look like. So I'll go ahead and save that and send it over to you virtually, and then maybe we can jump into that at the top of your hour.
Okay.
Great. Well, thanks again. We really appreciate your time today. We are going to hop in we're going to start moving towards our next presentation. I wanted to, I think, can everyone see my screen?
Yes. Yeah, we can.
So we've got the agenda up, and I just wanted to point out to folks that we did have to scramble and to make some adjustments to the agenda this morning. It was a fun morning. There were some oversights, and we have changed it, and it is reflected on your screen now. So as you can tell, David James started off the day, and we're continuing to have Al at 10, so he's up next. And then we're going to have David James back today at 11 o'clock, and he's going to do his presentation that he had planned to do tomorrow. So we thank you so much, David, again. And then we will do the noon presentation as we had normally planned. So I appreciate everyone's patience, and I tried to Google some Murphy's Law jokes that I could throw in for a few laughs, but I didn't find anything that applied or relevant. But with that, I wanted to remind everyone again, that we will be taking a 5-minute break between each presentation. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And then when we get back up, we will jump into Al's presentation. So I'll see everyone again at 10:10. Okay. Well, welcome back. It is 11:10, so we're going to get going again. Can you guys see the agenda up? Patrick?
Yes.
You're back yet? You can?
I'm on, yes, yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. So again, welcome everyone to the 2021 Pacific Northwest Pretreatment Workshop. I think this is the 28th annual. Yeah, 28th annual. Correct me if I'm wrong. We're excited to be able to present again this year, although it is virtually. We hope to see everyone next year in person in Vancouver at the Heathman. I did want to remind everyone that is interested in, and that doesn't know about the National Pretreatment Coordinator Group, but it is a really great resource for folks that are new in pretreatment and who have been in pretreatment for a long time. You know, it's a really great resource. So I encourage you to reach out to Gene Bennett in Everett, Washington, and I will put his email address up, and he will get you connected to the group's IO page or to the group. So with that, we are going to go ahead and say hello to Al. Al is joining us again today from Colorado.
Right.
Hi, Al. Welcome.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
You again.
For those of you who haven't met Al or don't know Al, he is a treat. He is a fantastic presenter, and I always learn so much. It looks like he spent half your career within a local pretreatment program, and since 2008, you have been the pretreatment coordinator for the EPA Region 8. So you have a lot of knowledge, and you have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge to share. It sounds like you guys are getting some snow this weekend, and that touches on some of your hobbies. You mentioned snowboarding, so you think you'll get out snowboarding this weekend?
Probably in a couple of weeks.
Oh, okay, in a couple of weeks. Well, once the snow is ready, I'm sure you'll be out there. And
Better.
I don't know any of the snowboarding like terms, but anyways, it's so. Thank you again. Yeah, shredding it or something, or maybe that's skateboarding. I don't know. It's getting awkward. So let's go ahead and jump into your presentation. You're joining us today, and you're going to talk about compliance guidance, and it's a part 2 of last week's presentation. So I will hand over the reins to you. It looks like we can see your page. It's not in presentation or view just yet. But again, thank you and welcome, Al. There you go. That looks good.
Sure. So thanks, Andrea. I appreciate it. You know, I'm looking forward to going back to on-site conferences also. We have one in Region 8 that we're planning on having it in April of 2022. You know, if we can go back to on-site, it'll be in Grand Junction. Grand Junction is a really cool place. It's a great place for mountain biking. The last time we had it in Grand Junction, we had a networking opportunity where we all took limos and went to a distillery, a winery, and a brewery for all of us to be able to go behind the scenes and see how they make stuff and how they take care of the wastewater at each of those places. It was a great place to network too. Thank God we had the limos to bring us back to the hotel. There's also great mountain biking there too. So I'm looking forward to starting these on-site conferences again. I'm looking forward to being invited to go out there next year. I really, you know, I really appreciate the Pacific Northwest, PNPW, Pacific Northwest Pretreatment Workshop, because you guys put on a great presentation. You know, the conferences are great, the speakers are great. It's a great place to network. So I really, you know, hope that we're all getting back to normal now and we're all safe and healthy. This is really weird for me, you know, given these remote presentations, because I'm used to not staying by a podium. I'm used to walking all over the stage and having a wireless mic and being able to see people and get that feedback from people as I'm giving this presentation. Now I see my 15-inch laptop. The only person that's looking back at me is my dog, So if you hear any unknown type of noises, I blame my dog. I have an excuse. I like biting. So yeah, I'm looking forward to being here. So this is kind of like part two, I guess. And the beauty of these regional conferences is that we are able to really get into the details, get into the weeds, so to speak, of our program and talk about self-improvement and get involved with training and get involved with networking. I agree with David James, and by the way, David, I appreciate you being flexible and going on at before me, because that was an attribute to your professionalism. I really appreciate that. I thought I was going to have to go first. So when you go behind the scenes of a conference, it's amazing, what happens, what makes this show. So I would have had to comb my hair like in about 2 minutes instead of just being ready to present at this time. It's really weird going from a Mountain Standard Time to Pacific to East Coast. I'm used to headquarters back in Washington, D.C. I'm not necessarily used to the West Coast. So it throws me off a little bit of what time it is here when it's 9 o'clock there. So for today, what I thought I would do is talk about, just some things that are framework of a pre-treatment program, what we always do. And it doesn't matter what type of program you have, whether you are dealing with categorical industrial users, a significant industrial user, either mom and pop shop, a large corporation, or even restaurants at a oil and grease program that's based on best management practices. There's always that opportunity within a program to talk about compliance evaluation and potentially enforce. So I always think of that as the carrot and the stick. The carrot is being able to actively listen, being able to hear their concerns, being able to address the situation based on your knowledge of the regulations and the situation that's in front of you. So I talked about this last week, when I gave a presentation, is really provide those resources that you can go out there and do inspections, because during the inspections, you can gather information that will stay in your program forever, that you'll be able to use to determine what sort of categorical determination, as David mentioned, what sort of permit and permit conditions are appropriate for that type of determination, whether that's based on EPA categorical pretreatment standards or local limits or BMPs. For a restaurant, you're able to gather that information and determine what's your response. And typically, honestly, our first response to the industries in our service area are education, is compliance assistance, is outreach, and actively listening to those problems. Those are the first step that we have to any industry user. So I thought what I would do is talk about that whole matrix of communication and follow-up to a industry user, and it starts with outreach. So just wanted to just walk through that and just talk about just what our opportunities are. I agree with David and actually with Julie last week. I was able to pop off and on some of the talks, and I listened to Julie's talk, and I agree. We are wastewater dweebs. We all are part of this really cool club, the Brown and Yellow Club, right? Where we are dweebs, we're nerds. We get involved with wastewater. The best jokes I've ever told are scatological jokes or wastewater jokes. There's nothing funnier than a pee or a turd joke. No, seriously. Those are the fun things that we have at conferences, and it's kind of a cool club. So we are wastewater dweebs, But the reality is that, as David mentioned when he first started talking, is that we are the protectors of this asset. No one thinks of a wastewater treatment plant as an asset to a community, but it's amazing when you lose it. I've done some emergency responses in North Dakota for flooding, in Colorado when we had flooding in 2013, in the hurricane situations down in Louisiana and Texas. And there's a fine line between what we know as civilization and just utter chaos. When I was up in North Dakota, they had flooding because of the winter, and the snow and the ice dams that they had in the rivers. And so the rivers weren't really flowing; they were dammed up by ice, and it was flooding into the service area, and it would flood so much that they would lose their collection system. They would lose their distribution system, also in the drinking water. So I went out there with a drinking water expert from the state and also from EPA and FEMA to do evaluations on what will it take to get this community back into business, to be able to do their business, so to speak. it's amazing when you walk into a town that has a population of 10,000 people or 20,000 people, and there's no wastewater treatment or there's no drinking water distribution. It puts you in a different place because now you got to carry, just cleaners and, it's just different. There was a city that I went to in North Dakota where each block was assigned a porta potty. And imagine that in the middle of winter in North Dakota, one porta potty for the block. And some may have been, have been decorated more than others. There was rumors that some porta potties were being taken in the middle of the night to move to another block, so they have 2 porta potties. It's utter chaos. There's a fine line between that. So what job you guys are doing to protect these assets that we have, the wastewater plant, the collection system, I'm an advocate for you guys, and I want to make sure that you guys understand that EPA is supportive of you and your endeavors to protect your wastewater treatment plant. So part of I guess this presentation is that I'm going to go back and forth from my presentations over to some documents, kind of like I did last week. So let me just start, I guess. I feel like I'm rambling. And so I always start with the building blocks of a pre-treatment program coming from the general pre-treatment regulations. There's no doubt about it. We're all regulators. Some are at the local level, some at the state level, some at the federal level. And so it's our responsibility to ensure that we understand the regulations. So again, going back to the building blocks, I'm going to be talking about the enforcement response plan, which is 40 CFR Part 403.8 F5. Okay, I'm kind of embarrassed, I know that off the top of my head. But let's talk about the regulatory framework of enforcement, just that enforcement scheme, before we talk about the enforcement response plan. So one requirement is that in your legal authority, you have these conditions. You have these, I guess the best way to put it is that you have these authorities. You have to have the authority to obtain remedies for noncompliance. So you have to be able to evaluate compliance. You have to know the regulations. You have to know what's noncompliance with those regulations or your permit conditions or your BMPs for any pretreatment standard and requirement. And remember, a best management practice is a pretreatment standard. A local limit is a pretreatment standard. You have to be able to seek injunctive relief, which I'll talk about a little bit later, for noncompliance with those pretreatment standards. And you have to have the authority to seek or assess penalties. And remember, the regulations were put into place in 1983. That was way back in the day. I think they were still wearing bell bottoms back then. And so 1983 dollars are different in dollars today. So, but the minimum when these were established is that you should have the authority to seek penalties, whether it's civil or criminal, in at least the amount of $1,000 a day for each violation. So I thought about a poll question. I didn't realize that they were going to have one in here, but I'm curious on how many programs still have $1,000 a day. Raise your hand. I mean, I can see behind all this camera. I can't even see myself, but I can see you guys. So if you still have $1,000 a day, it's appropriate to reconsider that, because inflation, it's amazing what those are in today's dollars. And I'll show some ordinances where they have raised them. Under the legal authority, you also have to ensure that you're able to enforce those remedies that are set forth in your ordinance. So you have to have the ability to carry out inspections. You have to have the right of entry. You have to have the ability to have self-monitoring and independent sampling. As David mentioned, you need to ensure that you're able to issue orders, whether they're compliance orders or administrative orders. You have to be able to establish control mechanisms or permitting. You have to have requirements to require conditions such as reporting and notifications that are imposed by those regulations. So you have to have the ability to really establish that framework of your pre-treatment program. So as David mentioned, when I go out and do audits, it's amazing what an EPA type of badge or credential. When I go out there in support of a program, I want to make sure this industrial user knows that the program that I'm auditing, the control authority, has that ability to have all these mechanisms in place. But it's my first responsibility to ensure that they understand it first. So if the control authority is implementing these regulations, by all means, I'll support them. I'll flash my badge, and that industrial user will ensure that you guys are the control authority and the authority in that service area. So In addition, you know, and I'm not going to go through all this reading, but you have to have the ability to halt or prevent the discharge of pollutants, and especially those that create an imminent endangerment. Not only your PHW, not only your collection system, but what's most important to us, worker health and safety. So you want to make sure that the people that are in the collection system, that are working at your treatment plant, are protected. And this is where the pre-treatment standards are in place. This is our responsibility to ensure that we're not overlooking violations. We're discovering any noncompliance as appropriate, and we're following up on it. You have to have the ability to seek judicial relief, you know, have some sort of partnership or agreement with courts, whether that's local, whether that's with state, or whether that's with EPA through our CID program. You also should, you know, establish administrative penalty authority. When I was a local pre-treatment coordinator, most of our enforcement actions when it came to penalties were carried out through an administrative penalty, and it was civil, and it was done through my office. We had a show cause hearing, and we had an officer that was there, but once the arbitration was completed, then we were able to do that penalty. And that's a very feasible and efficient tool, as opposed to going to courts to have some sort of order put down, you know, for civil or criminal penalties. So let's talk about that penalty authority. You know, so again, you know, when this was established, you know, $1983, all PHWs shall have the authority to seek or assess civil or criminal penalties in at least the amount of $1,000 a day for each violation. Okay, so if you look at 1983, $1,000 times the inflation rate of 2.70% per year, that's about $2,700 today. Okay, so that $1,000 that you're assessing, and you know, if you use enforcement discretion and maybe only penalize that $200 per violation per day, ask yourselves as a PHW. You don't need to ask your regulators, but you can. But ask yourself internally: is this enough incentive for this particular facility to comply with the regulations, or are they paying to pollute? The reality is, and the really difficult thing about enforcement, and this is what I learned when I was a local pre-treatment coordinator, is that a lot of times you want to step back, and you want to look at, you know, how you're enforcing and how you're providing incentive for non-compliance. Is it really working? You know, are you issuing NOVs forever and they are not coming to compliance? Are you issuing penalties that may not be effective and they're not coming to compliance? So this is something to look at, is that in your legal authority, can you update your legal authority to ensure you have that incentive for compliance? What I recommend, you know, this is kind of a side note, what I recommend is that at the end of the year or at the beginning of the calendar year, and I mean, I'm still used to calendar years. Here at EPA, we have what we call the fiscal years, which end in September, and the beginning of our fiscal year. So first quarter at EPA is October 1st, 2021, but we call it the first quarter of our fiscal year, 2022. But it's just kind of a side note. But what we used to always do at a local program is at the very end of the year or at the beginning of the year, we'd always close the book, so to speak, on our pre-treatment program. So we would make sure that we'd evaluate our performance as a program. We would look to see if we had any non-compliance issues and how we address them. And is there a pattern? Is there a pattern of non-compliance? Is there a pattern of our enforcement remedies? And has that resulted in compliance by the those chiefs? If not, that's where we had to step back and said, okay, is there a need for escalating enforcement action? Is there a need to maybe increase, you know, the amount of penalties that we have based on the violations? Are we using enforcement discretion too liberally? You know, so all those things you can definitely do. It's your responsibility to do, to make sure that you're carrying through on your legal authority for your enforcement. So let me get off of this slideshow presentation and to show you guys a ordinance where. So there's no doubt about it. You know, you are required to follow state law. You know, there are some ceilings, there are some caps on every state on how much penalty authority you can establish in your ordinance. So every state's different. So I can't necessarily say that, you know, in Oregon or Washington, you know, here's the maximum penalty amount. That's your responsibility to make that determination with your city attorney, and go as high as you can. You know, so here in Colorado, you can see, oops, that's a little bit too big. you can see that under their civil penalties, they have established, up to $25,000 per day per violation. This gives them that ability to ensure that this industrial user is not paying to pollute, that this is an incentive for compliance. So that's one thing I'd recommend. It's not a requirement, but just think about how effective are your penalties if you ever get to that point. Go back to the presentation. Okay, so now let's talk about the enforcement response plan itself, and we're going to go through this. This is whenever I'm at audits, and actually, when I was a local pretreatment coordinator, to be honest with you, I didn't necessarily know my enforcement response plan. I knew how to do inspections very well. I knew how to do sampling very well. I could issue a permit like no one's business. But when it came to enforcement response, we don't do that often. Especially when it comes to enforcement response plan, the escalated action. So I have to admit that that was probably one of the last documents that I really knew in and out. Until I came to some enforcement actions where we had to escalate penalties. That's when I learned that lesson about this. And so I wanted to walk through this with you just to make sure that you have that ability proactively to go through your enforcement response plan, to make sure it's not arbitrary and capricious, to ensure that you have the legal authority, and to ensure you understand the process. That's kind of the goal of this one. So under the pretreatment regulations, here's the requirement, okay? One of the procedures is that you have to develop and implement an enforcement response plan, okay? And in 403.5, actually, it's really kind of broad. What it says is, it says that shall contain detailed procedures. We don't really tell you what those procedures are. It tells how you will investigate and respond to instances of industrial noncompliance. This plan at a minimum shall, these 4 things. What does this mean? Describe how the PHW will investigate instances of noncompliance. Well, that's pretty much our whole program, right? Describe the types of escalated enforcement responses the PHW will take in response to all anticipated types of industrial user violations identified by title and adequately reflect the PHW's primary responsibility to enforce all applicable pretreatment standards and requirements. Kind of broad, so when you first look at these regulations, it's a little difficult to really anticipate, again, since David James talked about the audit this morning, what do the regulations require? What will your auditor look for? And what, more importantly, is adequate and effective for your program in order to ensure that you are incentivizing compliance. So first, I mentioned that we'll talk about the whole matrix of communication and follow-up to industrial users. Again, the majority of work that we do is compliance assistance, and let's make sure we're very clear that compliance assistance is how do you comply with the regulations, not what do you do to comply with those regulations. We do not tell them what treatment to put in place. We don't tell them the vendor that they have to go to. We don't tell them techniques or specific procedures that we would recommend. We provide compliance assistance. Here's what the regulations require. Here's what your facility does. Here may be some things, to get you out of liability. When I do inspections, whether it was local or even here at EPA, when I do oversight inspections, I speak the language of liability. Industries know liability and they're trying to minimize or eliminate those. So if you speak the language of liability, it could be that you're at a facility, for example, and it's a machine shop, and they're not a metal finisher, they just do machining. So they don't have any of those core operations, but they have potential for slug discharges. They have oils that are over a drain. They may have handling or housekeeping procedures, with these chemicals that result in a potential for a slug discharge and a concern for you. So the language of liability is to say, all right, here's our evaluation of your facility, and here's the control mechanism and potentially the exposure to the regulations that you're limited to. Here's the reporting requirements, here's the penalty requirements, here's the non-compliance situations. This is the road that you're going down, unless you are able to minimize or eliminate these slug discharges or these spills. Maybe you can move these chemicals away from the drain. They have a variety of ways that they can do to get out of compliance systems. But the key is that you're talking the language of liability to these facilities. So that's, again, a variety of different layers. It's definitely outreach. It's your responsibility to know the regulations. And as I mentioned last week, it's amazing what you get out when you read the regulations, whether that's the pretreatment regulations in 403, and again, 403.8 and 403.12, or it's the specific categorical pretreatment standards that are applicable to that particular facility. Know your ordinance, okay? So that sort of knowledge, that sort of preparation will allow you to be able to then quickly, understand what they're doing at that facility and how you can synthesize some of these conditions into a specific situation that is specific to what they do. So be knowledgeable about your job. You can provide outreach. You can participate in that education, which is both ways. We're trying to educate them. We're being educated by them also. Engaging the industry user. The very art, I guess, of doing inspections. We have the right of entry, we have the credentials, we have that ability and that authority to be in that facility. But what makes it effective? What really makes it effective is engaging that industry user. I have gone through the gamut of inspections, and there's no doubt about it. When you're new, and sometimes even when you're having a down week, I guess, you're nervous, to go into a facility for the first time and trying to explain the purpose of your inspection, who you are, what your authority is. We can be bad cop for sure, but it's so much more effective to be a engaging person, to be able to engage them, to identify things that you may have in common or have some sort of a conversation about. It's in my experience that most managers or staff that you come across are really proud of their company, or if they're a mom and pop shop, what they did to develop this company and to evolve it. So if you engage them on that type of conversation, you can definitely start to gather information about what they do. Active listening is definitely a skill, for sure. So why do we do enforcement? I realize you get through all this. Oops. For sure, it's to ensure compliance. The success of our well, I guess the reason that we're in existence is to ensure compliance. The reason we're ensuring compliance is to protect our wastewater treatment plant, our collection system, and the workers in the collection system and at our wastewater treatment plant. Protect the community. Ensure that, again, that we're not going into that line of chaos if our wastewater treatment plant goes down. We're also there to deter non-compliance. We're there to deter other polluters. I guarantee you, if you drop that pebble of enforcement in that lake, the ripples will go throughout your whole service area. I remember when we first started the oil and grease program at my local pretreatment program. For a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, we were kind of there to do inspections. We did a good job pulling manholes and just making evaluations on the grease interceptor. But it seemed like we got into this whole routine of reminding them. You were reminding you that you had to pump out your grease interceptor. We're reminding you that you had to repair your cap. Your T was broken. We're always reminding them. We realized that best management practices are pretreatment standards. So instead of reminding them, we started enforcing the non-compliance. And it was amazing. The first enforcement case we had with the penalty created that ripple in our service area. Other restaurants understood that we're taking this seriously, we're consistent, we're fair, we're objective, and we saw compliance rates that were increased. So yeah, we're definitely there to deter other polluters from coming to compliance. We want to level the playing field. So again, going back to oil and grease, whether you're a mom and pop shop or McDonald's, they're both held to the same standard. They're both held to the same cost of doing business, so to speak, and it levels that playing field for everyone. And yeah, sometimes that carrot or other carrots just don't work, and the stick is necessary. So punishment is part of it if it's based on their performance. It's not our job to give them a break. There certainly is enforcement discretion. but ensure that you're consistent, ensure that you're fair, ensure that you're equitable, and ensure that you're objective. Because if you take, you know, if you ignore it, or if you take too many shortcuts sometimes, so to speak, which, you know, happens sometimes, during an audit, you definitely don't want EPA or the state to discover it, because we, you know, when I'm out at an audit, I do my best. I'm pretty good actually at looking at paperwork and records and trying to connect all the dots, as David James talked about this morning. So, you know, this is just taking all the regulations in bullets. And, you know, what we want to do in the enforcement response plan is to ensure that all those regulations we talked about that you are establishing in your ordinance or your rules and regulations are implemented. You know, so we don't want to create new authority. We want to implement the authority that we're establishing in our ordinance. So, you know, all these things, these are the general part of an ERP. You know, reflect your responsibility, identify how you will investigate non-compliance, you want to specify officials, and you want to determine anticipate types of violations and how you will, you know, you provide escalated enforcement. The key to escalated enforcement is to ensure that you're able to identify the pattern or the magnitude of that violation. You know, day-to-day violations occur. You know, I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's no one that's in 100% compliance. But, you know, you want to make sure you have a response to it, whether that's a phone call or whether that's an NOV, whether that's all the way up to a show cause hearing and a penalty. That's up to the pattern and that magnitude of the violation. So an ERP is definitely required under the pretreatment regulations. You know, it's a consistent path, you know, and let me go back, you know, when, you know, we're all in that routine of implementing the pretreatment program. So what I recall is that, you know, there's field work and there's office work. You know, you're out doing sampling, you're out doing inspections, you're out, you know, doing some oil and grease inspections, maybe, you know, trying to pull some manholes, you're doing local limit sampling, you're writing permits, you're having correspondence back and forth. We're always on the phone with our industrial users. And then all of a sudden you have a violation where you now have to go to your ERP, you know, and go maybe escalating from a typical NOV or a phone call as a response to documentation. That throws your whole week off. That throws your whole month off. Sometimes that throws your whole year off, because, you know, it's one of those things where you're like, you know, now you have to get into that enforcement mode, I used to call it, where you have to document, of course, you have to ensure that you're fair and you're equitable. You have to really identify what is the escalated response. That sucks, to be honest with you, you know, but it is our responsibility, because, you know, you always want to keep in the back of your mind the holistic view that we're there to protect our treatment plant. We're there to enforce equitable standards and requirements, and we're there to ensure compliance, you know, but it's not, you know, it's not something that's always very welcome, to be honest with you, when you get that. And it always seems to happen on Friday at like 2 o'clock when you're ready to go to happy hour. And it's like, you know, you get a phone call from your collection system and you're just like, you know, I have to get in the van, I have to go investigate it, and all of a sudden it becomes this massive police code enforcement type of response. You know, that's on the personal side, but the enforcement response plan, this is part of our resources. This is to ensuring that whatever we do is objective and is consistent. So before we use this ERP, let's see how, you know, what are the bones behind it? You know, what does it mean to have an ERP that your auditor, whether it's David James or Al Garcia, God help you, comes in and does an inspection or an audit? What you know is you know, what does it mean to meet those regulations, those really broad regulations? Well, here's kind of the outline that I look for, you know, and I have discussions with, and I actively engage the PHW, and we talk about, you know, just what is effective to your program. What I've identified is that it's really 7 different types of sections, you know, the introduction purpose, the definitions, how you identify and investigate instances of non-compliance. And again, we don't need to go to all the details in the weeds, but just a summary of it or a referral to SOPs. What are the types of enforcement actions that you've established in your ordinance? What's the personnel that you have? Is it one person or is it 17 people that all take a different role in enforcement? What is your actual guide based on anticipated types of violations, and how do you incorporate S&C? I'll probably say this a couple times, so S&C, significant non-compliance, is a requirement under the procedures. You have to not only evaluate for compliance in day-to-day situation, but also throughout the long term. Okay, it's based on pattern and magnitude. So S&C, if you come upon an S&C situation, just publishing them in the newspaper is not the enforcement remedy. You have to escalate enforcement for S&C. Okay, so the publication is not the remedy. Okay, just want to make sure I'll probably say that a couple times. So for a poll question, how many times did I say S&C? Maybe that's a great poll question. I bet it's in the hundreds. So let's look at the introduction and purpose. Okay. All right, these bullets like this. So, as we talked about, in your introduction, in your purpose of your ERP, you want to make sure that you have connected to your ordinance. You've cited that legal authority that you've established in your ordinance or your rules and regulations, and also, as David James mentioned, you also address the legal authority, the IGAs. You've addressed that. What gives you that ability to implement pretreatment, including enforcement, in an outside contributing jurisdiction? So make sure that introduction and purpose provides that clarification, that citation, or the link to your ordinance, to your legal authority. So definitions and acronyms. I've seen a lot of definitions and acronyms that are not in the ordinance or the rules and regulations. What I recommend is practically just go to the relevant definitions in your legal authority, copy and paste them, and pop them into your ERP. I'll show some examples of those as we go along. So there's a variety of ways. We're always in a pretreatment program. Don't sell you guys short. We're always identifying, we're always investigating instances of noncompliance. When we gather information, we are identifying, we're investigating instances of noncompliance. That's not a bad thing, by the way. And so you don't need to really go into the weeds and how you do that in your ERP, but you can refer to SOPs. For example, here's my SOP for the industrial user inventory. Here's how I gather information on who's in my service area. Here's how I characterize what they do, and here's how I notify them of applicable pretreatment standards. There may be a metal finisher that is operating illegally without a permit. That's non-compliance. So how do you investigate those instances? How do you evaluate the completeness of a report or notices? How do you ensure that it's in compliance with the permit conditions? Those type of things is where you just want to give sort of that 10,000-foot level on how you will investigate these. So, along with that, how do you know when a violation has occurred? What sort of information do you use from your ordinance that will provide you that information? And again, it's all these situations where you definitely want to have that part of your ERP. The same thing with compliance evaluation. Describe the SOP and how you review, how you receive, how you review, how do you evaluate that data, how do you store that data, and how do you determine any compliance with S&C. And remember, for significant non-compliance, there's 3 numeric and there's 5 narrative S&C criteria. So you want to make sure when you calculate or you determine S&C that you calculate and determine all of the S&C that you have in your ordinance. So just kind of a side note, and it seems like this is kind of an audit thing right this year, but for what's common for findings, and I kind of mentioned this last week, is that understand what your permits say, understand what the permit conditions are. Every permit should be site specific, so there may be some specific situations for company ABC that are different than company XYZ. So ensure what those are, and I definitely recommend that you develop a checklist for each SMR review, whether that's quarterly or whether that's twice a year or whether that's monthly, that you have these filled out, and that will provide you that assurance that these reports are complete. They have met all the reporting requirements of your permit, and you have been able to evaluate the compliance with those permit conditions. So I'm going to get off this presentation and show you one of these. And Andrea, if there's any questions, please feel free to interrupt me.
Will do. Thank you.
Okay. Just be very kind, please, when you interrupt me. So here's an example of an SIU self-monitoring report checklist, and I think I may have provided this once before, but what this does, whenever the self-monitoring report comes in, whether that's from a CIU or an SIU, whether that's based on categorical pre-treatment standards or local limits, there's still permit limits. So what you want to do is to be able to evaluate all this compliance situations for that particular report. When that comes in, let's say it's first quarter of the calendar year 2022. And so is it submitted on time? Is it past 45 days and an SNC, which may be one of your SNC criteria? Did they report no discharge? Is it signed appropriately? All these are the first things that you should really evaluate. All the narrative stuff. Is it on time? Is it complete? Is it signed? For the sampling and analysis, have they sampled for all permit required pollutants? This is one of the difficult things, and a lot of times I remember looking at self-monitoring reports. So when I was a local pre-treatment coordinator, I think I had 17 permits. And so when they would come in, a lot of times they come in the same week at the end of a particular quarter, and I would go cross-eyed trying to look at all those reports. So this really helped me to make sure I was on task, I was on point, because every permit was a little bit different. There may have been some different local limits and quantity of local limits, or metal finishing or like heavy metals from metal finishing permits, which actually, after looking at 4 SMRs in one morning, my eyes would go cross-eyed. So this really helped me stay on point to ensure that when I looked at a permit, when I looked at the self-monitoring report, it was complete. Everything was sampled. If there was a TTO certification, they included that. It was signed appropriately. The lab reports, which I recommend that when you look at self-monitoring reports, really look at the lab reports. Ensure that their data is in control. It passes the QA/QC from the laboratory. There's no J values. There's nothing that will affect the defensibility or the enforceability of that data. So going through the lab reports, going through the COC, I would definitely recommend. Have they submitted their pH? Is it continuous? Is it daily? Is it based on a batch? All those you can choose from. Have they submitted the appropriate pH monitoring data? Is it legible? Are there any violations? Have they used the appropriate methods? All these things are important to ensure the enforceability of that data. Are there any violations? If there are violations, is this the first time that you've been notified, or did they give you a notification within 24 hours, and have they done a 30-day resample? I don't know how many times we've had violations, because the first time I saw a violation was during a quarterly report, when it actually happened 2 months ago, and their 24-hour kicked in when they became aware of that violation. There are some sort of arbitrary, some gray areas on when they became aware of it. One thing that I would recommend, and that we did in my local program, is if they were on continuous pH monitoring, I made damn sure they had alarms. I made sure that they had that ability to become aware of it, and wasn't at the end of the month when they downloaded their chart or they downloaded their computer records. I want to make sure that if they have a violation of pH at 1.0 for 20 hours, they're aware of it, we're aware of it, they're able to stop it. Okay. So just make sure that these reports are complete. You've evaluated compliance, and I've seen these, during audits, which I absolutely love. If you have a quarterly report and you have this as a very first page, we have gone through all these questions, and this could be specific to your permit. It doesn't need to be this, for example. It could be whatever specific to the conditions of your permit and the limits of your permit. But if I see this at the beginning, I can use this sort of as a crosswalk to make sure that you've reviewed it on time, you've signed it, is there any correspondence, or is there any violations? I think this is a great tool for programs use. And again, it's not for audits, it's for self-improvement, ensuring that you're on task, you're on point with our responsibilities to evaluate compliance. So yeah,
Al?
you know,
Oh.
yes, go ahead.
We did have a question or two pop up, and
Sure.
we are nearing the end of the hour. Would you like me to go ahead and throw those out to you, or do you want to wrap up in a way?
You can throw those questions out to me, Andrea.
You want to throw them out there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. You know, and of course, you know, we can be flexible, so running over by a few minutes is totally fine. The first question is an SNC question, and I'm just going to read it to you. It says,
Okay.
ERP evaluates repeated non-compliance in the last 6 months. One user had an SNC for the same type of violation about 13 months apart, 3 years in a row. This is her first question. How would you escalate enforcement? And 2, would you recommend any modification to our ERP matrix? We have a column for first violation in 6 months and escalating enforcement for reoccurring violation in 6 months.
Good question. You know, so for SNC, we had a policy, and this is not the regulations, by the way, but we're trying to figure out what does it mean when you have a pattern of not only violations, but SNC criteria. And what does that mean for the ERP? And so we had a matrix that talked about the pattern of SNC. And I don't remember what those were, but I'm sure I could dig it up. But you know, it was how many occurrences in SNC did you have in a calendar year, and were they sequential? You know, because that gave us information on what is the performance of them, you know, complying with the permit. And so yeah, you know, I mean, so what I'd recommend is you as a program really evaluate what does it mean to have evidence of their performance, you know. And again, you know, the short term are the day-to-day violations that everyone has. They may have a pH below 5, but what does it mean when they have pHs below 5 every single day? And that puts them in SNC for that quarter. And then the next quarter they have SNC again, and then they skip a quarter, they're good. And then the fourth quarter they have SNC again. What does that mean throughout the year? You know, you guys have that authority to determine what is that pattern of compliance and how would you recycle it? You know, so I guess that'd be my answer. I can really work through some of the specifics if you want, but you guys have the authority to determine what is that pattern of compliance and how would you establish that, and is that fair and not arbitrary? Does that help, Andrea?
That makes sense. Yeah. Thanks, Al. We've got one more if you're open to it. So this one reads, what would you recommend to encourage the return of industrial waste surveys? If an industrial user refuses, is it reasonable to claim that you cannot ensure compliance without them returning your survey?
So in your ordinances, I would recommend you establish, so we have deadlines for soft monitoring reports, for baseline monitoring reports, for notices. We have deadlines for those based on the permit. I would recommend that you also have a deadline for other reports as required by the PHW or the control authority. Establish that in your ordinance first. Have the same type of deadlines that you would for your other reports. That way you at least have the authority to look at your ERP and have it, the remedies, the response as necessary. So if they don't report to you because, you know, they're late and it's past 30 days, they may be in SNC. You have that ability if you establish that in your ordinance first. Okay. So that's what we did, is to say other reports as required, you have 30 days to respond to us. And then we used our discretion on what does that mean as far as that performance. Did they refuse? Is it complete? I had one report that came back, and seriously, all they said is that we generate pee and turds. And so that was the first one that I went to do an inspection on. And yeah, it turns out they were a warehouse. All they did was pee and turds. So it was complete, actually. But, you know, just give yourself that authority to enforce that violation, because it's not a violation until you establish that in your ordinance.
Okay, gotcha. Good insight.
Sure.
What about, you know, is it reasonable for us to say that we are not ensuring compliance? You know, if without them returning the survey?
Yes, it's reasonable. Yeah, it's reasonable. You know, I mean, it's difficult to evaluate compliance if you don't have information. And if you're requiring that report, then they need to ensure that they're meeting your requirements. That is a pre-treatment requirement if you establish that in your ordinance.
Okay. Great, thank you. Those were the two that just recently popped up. Oh, we had one more. If you're open to it, are individual best management practices such as food service or small brewery BMPs incorporated into an ordinance by reference? Or do you put the entire BMP for each category in your ordinance?
I've seen both, you know, so the very first thing is to establish BMPs as pre-treatment standards. How do you do that? You apply the definition, you ensure that BMPs are part of your permit conditions, you ensure that BMPs are part of your S&C criteria, and you have BMPs as part of your record keeping. Okay, these are the responsibilities we have in our legal authority. Once you establish those as pre-treatment standards, then I've seen them both ways. You know, I've seen them where the whole sector control program, for example, for oil and grease, is a whole section of the ordinance. I've seen it where they refer to a policy. What's the difference? So if you establish the conditions of BMPs for restaurants, or for low pH, or for breweries, which, by the way, if you guys need help with breweries, I'm there for you. If you establish those in your ordinance, you want to make changes, you have to change your ordinance. If you do it in a policy that you refer to, you can make changes in the policy as long as it meets the overarching authority in your ordinance. So, for example, for restaurants, the BMPs typically that I see are, you got to have technology, which is a grease interceptor. It needs to be sized appropriately, you know, depending on the restaurant. You need to operate and maintain it, and you need to keep records. It's really 4 BMPs. And the same things can apply to other sector control programs. But if you make any of those changes, in your program, then you got to update your ordinance. Whereas in a policy, you can do it in a policy.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
No, those were the last. That was the last one that came through. So.
Okay. I probably have like 10 more minutes. So let me go through here. So there's no doubt about it. You know, we all have unique programs, which is really cool for us to get together and talk about, you know, wastewater jokes and our programs, because we all have differences. We all have different styles on how we meet that standard. As long as we're meeting that standard, that's what's important. So within those differences of our program, there's a variety of anticipated types of violations and types of escalated enforcement. So you want to make sure that your ERP is specific to your program. Okay. Your titles may be different, you know, but just make sure that is practical. Whenever I see ERPs that have the mayor of the city will do everything, will do NOVs, and they don't delegate it, it's not going to work. It really isn't. You know, you want to make sure that the pre-treatment coordinator, the people that are involved, are the ones that are able to evaluate compliance and follow through with enforcement. So make sure that whoever is responsible. So you could have different tiers. For example, you could have the pre-treatment specialist or the permit writer be responsible for NOVs, be responsible for phone calls, be responsible for SSC determinations. You could have the pre-treatment manager or the coordinator, however you're organized, be responsible for managers meetings or show cause hearings. You can have your director be responsible for some of that. You can have your attorney be responsible for any civil or criminal penalties. Administrative penalties done from the pre-treatment coordinator's office is a great tool, by the way. Just make sure these are practical. You know, there's no magic formula on this. Just make sure, again, this is a tool for you, not a paperwork exercise, okay? So, you know, whenever I go to a program and I see they have hauled waste in their PHW and they don't have any actions or anticipated tax violations by hauled waste, I'll call them out of it, you know, because this is something you want. You want to make sure that whatever your program is, you have that ability to evaluate compliance. Well, first, let's step back to be able to provide outreach, you know, to help with compliance, to provide compliance evaluation, and to also enforce. And so the anticipated types of violations are different for everyone, but these are the things that I have found as a rule of thumb that is common throughout every program. So these are the ones that I look for in my checklist whenever I evaluate a program. And I provided this last week, and I'd be happy to provide it again. But I want to go into a little bit more detail. So these are the types of violations that I've seen throughout every program. If you have BMPs, ensure that you have the failure to implement BMPs as part of your ERP. You must include S&C. Ding, that's another one for the poll. You must ensure it's narrative and numeric S&C. These are the ones, so whenever I look at an ERP, I can't really predict what an ERP will be for a particular program, but what is common is S&C. S&C is universal, it's consistent, so S&C must be in your enforcement response plan. And let me go to that checklist just to show you what I'm talking about. So just to kind of, again, to mimic the regulations, here's where the requirements are for an ERP. We talked about the remedies for enforcement. But here's the procedures that you have to have at the very introduction. How will you describe your instances of noncompliance? How will you investigate those instances of noncompliance? And these are the areas of pretreatment that we typically do that. Inventory, permitting, self-monitoring, reporting, notification, control authority monitoring when you're out there doing sampling, and compliance evaluation, S&C determination. So, again, just a reference to your SOP or just a 10,000 foot level on how you do this is appropriate. These are the types of violations, and as I mentioned, unpermitted discharges, violations. Here's where I require S&C. We can definitely talk about unpermitted discharges on whether or not that should be in your ERP, but S&C for violation of permit limits is a requirement. S&C number C, which is any other violation of pretreatment standard, which is number C in the federal regulations, is required. If they're late to report, that's one thing. If they're above the 45-day or 30-day that's in your ordinance, that's S&C. So all these are ones that I will check. Here's the narrative S&C criteria that have to be in your ordinance. So if your if your ERP currently doesn't have this, make sure that you have these in your ERP. The circumstances and your response depending on escalating part of it. So for example, so back to your question, Andrea. So if they always do late reports that is above that 45 days every single quarter, they now have a pattern of reporting S&C. And so your escalated enforcement is above the S&C typical response. It would be above that. So whatever you have in your ordinance, that's the escalating that you should do to ensure that they are, for God's sakes, give me the report on time. What will it take for them to do that? So again, this checklist is available not just for me to evaluate your program in Region 8 or in Region 9, whoever goes to your program, but for you to improve it, and to really ensure that you have the tool to be able to effectively enforce all the pretreatment standards and requirements. Here, if applicable, if you have any BMPs, do you have the anticipated types of violations and truck and haul rates too? So I can provide this again. Let me jump to the EPA Model Ordinance. I'll make this bigger because I'll be talking about that real soon. But so for ordinance or rules and regulations, it goes through a certain format. It goes through the definitions, acronyms, the pretreatment standards as far as the general specific prohibitions, your local limits, the permitting conditions, the reporting requirements, and then enforcement. Okay, so you'll see in this EPA Model Ordinance, we've established the ability to do an NOV, consent orders, show cause hearings, compliance orders, administrative fines. You'll see in here that we don't say $1,000 a day. We say maximum fine allowed under state law. Okay. So there's all these tools in here that we have established in our ordinance, so to speak. Injunctive relief. Okay, so injunctive relief is compelling them to come back to compliance. So these are the tools that we have to put into our ERP, the termination of discharge, we have the authority. If for example, for some reason, if we didn't establish the administrative fines in our ordinance, we can't put that in our ERP. We have to implement whatever is in our ordinance. Okay, so these are the types of escalating types of circumstances. You know, is it isolated? Is it recurring? Is it a pattern? Was there harm to the PSW, including the collection system? You know, is it 30 days late or greater than 30 days late if that's your deadline? You know, S&C, ensure that all numeric criteria included. So these are the things that you want to identify. These are the things you want to escalate based on the circumstance and the pattern and magnitude of that violation or those violations. As I mentioned, you know, do not create new legal authorities in your ERP. Implement it from your ordinance or your rules and regulations, and include a time frame from when your response will be. You know, we have responsibility to not ignore it, to not procrastinate, to ensure that we're doing it as feasibly as possible. I don't expect enforcement corrective action items to be done in the next day or two, but there has to be a practical response to providing that incentive for compliance. So here's one ordinance that I've seen. I'm sorry, here's one ERP that I've seen, and I have no idea how to get from point A to potentially point Z over here. This is really confusing. Don't make it confusing. Don't make it impractical. Don't make it, you know, where you're subject to critique from the people that you're trying to enforce, from that CAU or that SIU. I guarantee you, your authority will not be challenged until you try to enforce. Don't make them confused like this. This is typically what I see, okay? The first violation, a 12-month period, no harm, NOV, 250 suspended, blah, blah, blah. The second violation, you know, now we're starting to look at pattern. Now we're starting to look at magnitude, because now it's involving harm. You know, so now it's SSC. So you'll see that the enforcement remedy has gone from just an NOV to now an AO, to administrative fine, to cease discharge. You know, so this is an example of the type of violation, effluent limitation or permit violation, and the escalating response based on the type of violation, the pattern, and the magnitude of that. There's a variety of enforcement actions that you can do, and you do have some enforcement discretion. You know, you are able to actively listen to them and see if they have any mitigating circumstances that make sense in your best professional judgment. And, you know, you do have some enforcement discretion, document them. You know, so phone calls, email, informal notification, NOVs, these are the type of enforcement actions that I typically see that are established in the ordinance first and then implemented in the ERP. We mentioned all this, the magnitude and the duration of the violation, the effect on the environment, the PHW, the pattern of past violations, which includes S&C, and their attitude, their recalcitrance, you know, their recalcitrance. Is this negligence or is this criminal? That's always something that you always want to keep in the back of your mind. There is a guidance that's really old that we have at EPA. One of our goals is to update this, and, you know, we all have things that are swept under the rug that we want to bring out and update this. So 1989 is a pretty decent guidance manual for this, but, you know, just keep in mind that we are planning to update this hopefully soon. So those are the questions that I have. I'm able to answer any questions that you may have.
I think we have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Got one, are individual BMPs such as food service or small brewery BMPs incorporated into the ordinance by reference, or do you put it in the entire BMP for each category in your ordinance?
Hey, Al, that was one that you answered earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen it both ways.
Yep, so we didn't have any questions since we asked, since the ones that we asked earlier.
Okay.
So sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and do the poll question. Okay.
Let's do it. Let's go ahead and do the poll.
Right, so sorry I didn't get the new one in, Al. I went based on what you gave me last time. So the poll question now is, Who is the greatest EPA coordinator? And your selections are Al Garcia, the amazing Al Garcia, the magnificent Al Garcia, or His Eminent Lordship Al Garcia.
Is there
You
a
got
fifth choice?
30 more seconds.
Is there a fifth, sixth, and seventh choice?
Yes, but they seemed redundant.
Okay. Or any Joe Schmo, I guess, would be my fifth choice.
And just as a reminder, folks, if you need CEUs, we'll have to have your participation in these poll questions.
So we got about 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, and the poll is closed. So it looks like His Eminent Lordship Al Garcia is the winner.
I have a new title. Thank you, Kevin.
You want that on your card, Al?
I should.
Yeah, we won't be surprised when you see that on your signature line and on your
It
emails.
costs too much money. I'm a cheap bastard.
Okay, that's it for the polls.
Hey, thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Al. Again, we really appreciate your willingness to share with our group. As always, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions for the presenter, you can use the question feature, which is in the panel, the GoToWebinar panel. You open that up, pop in a question, and we'll answer the questions. Or you can use chat you can also send a question through that as well, and you get to choose who you're sending your message to. So you can send it to the organizers if you want to ask privately. So I think there was some confusion there. Let's see. We are going to take that 5-minute break, or are we pushing it now? What do you think, Patrick?
I think we could use a 5-minute break.
Well, let's go ahead and keep it rounded. What do you think? What do you guys think about maybe 3 minutes, come back at 11:20? And that'll give Mr. James.
I think that's a good idea. We don't want to get too far out of the line.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and take, need to run to get more coffee, run to the bathroom, make it quick, and we'll see you guys again at 11:20.
About it. See you in a few minutes.
Okay, well, it is 11:20.
Nice.
Patrick, if you're ready, I'll let you go ahead and introduce the next speaker.
All right. Well, our guest speaker you should be somewhat familiar with. Up again, we have David James. He's going to be talking about pre-treatment program guidance, trial and error. You know, something else I didn't mention about David, he's served on the Water Environment Federation as well as the EPA group to control fats, oil, and grease. David, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, I'm going to switch it over. Let's see. You got it?
Yeah,
See,
let's
I
do
see
it.
your presentation. There you go.
You got it?
All right. Yeah, I see your note screen, so go ahead and swap it around.
Oops.
And I really like those historic pictures that you got in there.
Oh,
We've come a long way. You bet.
Thank you. Yeah, we have. Hey Ken, I don't know if you noticed if you reviewed my presentation, but I considered this to be quite a waste. It was before our times, but they were pouring liquor into the sewer, so maybe that was one of the other reasons that we started getting pretreatment regulations. What do you think?
I think I'm ill.
Well, there we go.
Yeah. That's alcohol abuse, huh?
Yeah, that is alcohol abuse. Well, welcome back, everybody. I wanted to introduce you to one of my favorite. My wife and I, we don't have kids, but we have this furry critter. Meat Muffin. So, like most cats, if you're a cat lover, you can really relate to this. Like most cats, they're pretty curious. And so, like pre-treatment program coordinators, they'll put together their program and they'll go out and do things. And they'll do something and then they'll go, So trial and error is kind of like we have to learn from the things that we do and the things that work great. And if they're not working, like after an audit or pre-treatment compliance inspection, we have to make some changes. So let's look at a few reasons that errors or failures, I'll call them failures, occur, like regarding pre-treatment programs. We have to wear, pre-treatment coordinators have to wear so many hats, and there's so many things that's going on, even outside the pre-treatment program, especially if that's not your full-time job, but you have to contribute to that. And so, and we've talked over and over again about, it's important to know and understand the regulations, understanding your pre-treatment program. And I talked about the inconsistency among pre-treatment program pieces where something in the ordinance or legal authority doesn't agree with what's in an SOP. One example would be, I've seen several, like when the program was modified or when the program was submitted for approval, oops, we might have missed where there was a disagreement in the time that somebody had to do something. It would say one thing in the legal authority, say something else in one of the SOPs. So the legal authority, of course, would rule. And so, but that would cause confusion in the program where, the coordinator would be doing things in accordance with the SOP. And it's like, no, the ordinance says it should be, 10 days instead of 15 days. So technically that would be a violation. But like Al was saying earlier, there is some enforcement discretion. So, that's something you have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. Inconsistency in how things are done. We get new staff, people change, things change. It's hard to keep up to date with everything. And if you take like a pretreatment inspector or two different inspectors and have them inspect the same facility, they may find different things. Everybody has kind of a different way of doing things. And then we talked about inadequate funding and resources. And I know we had a question a while ago about inadequate funding and resources. So at the end, I'm gonna answer that question and show you a document that might be useful. So different people's perspectives are, the perspectives are different for different people. So like with this slide, oops, let me find my cursor here. Where did my cursor go? Well, if you look at the slide on the left, depending on your perspective, you may see either an old woman or a young girl. Oh, I'm so aggravated I can't find my cursor here. It's got to be here somewhere. But anyway, so I can't even use my pen. But if you see an old woman, then you're gonna, on the far left, you're gonna see like a nose sticking out, or if it's a young woman, you'll see the side of the face and the neck, and it looks like there's a little necklace around the neck. And then likewise with the face of the Native American or an Eskimo. So different people have different perspectives, and that can sometimes lead to error. So some of you, particularly if you've worked with industries over a period of time, looking at lean manufacturing and things like that, one of the techniques that is commonly used is a method called 5 whys. And so anytime you have a failure or an error, one technique that you can use to try to get down to the root cause of why that occurred is the 5 whys. And it can be an important tool. It's certainly not the only one, but it helps you to get down to the bottom line of why something occurred. If you do have an error or failure, it's important to try to figure out what was the root cause of why did that failure really occur. And it's not about personalities or John forgot to do something or Jane forgot to do something. You keep the personal stuff out of it. It's about the process. It's like what didn't get done, no matter who it is or whatever. And that can kind of lead you to some training. For example, if you have a failure or an error, put a team together, put people together, sit them in a room, and this doesn't have to take a lot of time. Define the problem or a failure. So, for an example, the tank is overflowing. Okay, well, why is the tank overflowing? Oh, the water control valve is on. Oh, well, why would the water control valve be on? The control valve is faulty. Well, why is the control valve faulty? Oh, it didn't get tested. Well, why didn't it get tested? It's not on the maintenance schedule, so nobody knew to test it. So the corrective action might be add control valves to the maintenance schedule, inform staff performing the maintenance that it's now on the schedule, and make sure that they know how to test a control valve. And so I know this is kind of a simple thing, but again, hopefully you can see how that might be beneficial to you if you've never used this technique. So let's look at a few alleged violations. And like in the auditing world, if you've ever seen an auditing report, which I'm sure most, if not all of you have, there's like a citation, and then there's the finding, the failure to do X, Y, and Z, and then there's the documentation as to what the finding is. So, and Al's was talking S&C a while ago. This was Al, your presentation was a good segue to this slide and what I'm going to be talking about. So the top 2 criteria, those are the numeric criteria, like Al was talking about, and then we have the other C, D, E, F, G, H, which are non-numeric narrative criteria. And so sometimes these violations can be identified by looking at the annual reports, or it may come up during the initial interview or the fall review, or maybe you might see something even during an inspection that where you kind of go back and do a little bit of additional research. Wrong key there. So that's the E through H. So during audit, sometimes we would see that the CA failed to correctly calculate the S&C. And so, you know, for the chronic and the technical review criteria, which is A and B, they didn't calculate it correctly, or they didn't calculate S&C based on the rolling quarters basis. And I think it was back in 1991, EPA published a memo to all the regions about needing to use the rolling quarter. And then in 1992, there was another memo where they kind of illustrated that. I've got a slide that'll show you that in a little bit. And then another one is you know, S&C getting published in a newspaper, you know, that's not the enforcement, that's not the remedy like Al was saying, but that can sometimes be embarrassing for some industries, so they will come in and beg and say, please don't publish me. It's, you know, for some industries, that's quite a public relations nightmare, and for others, they could care less because a lot of people don't read the paper anymore, so so be it. So some of the programs, there's a variety of versions of this, but they've come across a checklist, and a lot of times we'll find that you know, during an audit they'll go, well, we're not documenting the fact that we're looking at you know, the non-numeric criteria because we haven't had any instances. Everybody's always turning their reports in on time. We haven't had any pass-through interference. All the compliance schedules are being met. And so they don't document the fact that they are evaluating that. And so then you do a file review and you find out, oh, well, there was a report that was 60 days late and there was no enforcement. So, you know, that's a red flag. That's an enforceable deal. And they were going, oh, we must have missed that. And then you go through another file that's somebody else's industry, and they've done the same thing. So all of a sudden, that shows there's like a systemic type of failure. And so, you know, this is a type of checklist that can be used to help make sure that that everything is done consistently, and that you'll find a problem if there's a violation of one of the S&C criteria. And then the rolling quarter basis can be kind of confusing too. And so the first quarter starts with the, if you will, the first quarter of the pretreatment year, but then you got to go back 3 months and evaluate S&C for that entire 6-month period. So in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move on. Hopefully most, if not all of you, have a good handle on that. Sometimes when a pretreatment program submits an annual report, they won't submit it in a timely period. They won't submit it annually. And so this was actually a violation, types of violations that we saw more frequently than I would have guessed, because the permit's really clear. But that goes back to the importance of reviewing your permit and being familiar with what it says. The other thing is, like, whenever an annual report is turned in, if it hadn't been done prior to this, at least if there have been any changes in the program where you change forms, you change language in a permit template, that's a modification to the program. And so the approval authority needs to have a record of that change, so that when an auditor or pretreatment compliance inspector shows up and they know what the approved program is, and all of a sudden they go out and they say, oh, you're not using the template out of the approved program, that's a problem. One of the other things is a failure to sample for certain pollutants that are in 40 CFR Part 122 Appendix D, Table 2 and 3. And then I know we've had situations like, for example, it used to be the chemical toilet waste, like, let me back up. So there's also Table 5, which are hazardous pollutants. And it says if you have reason to believe or suspect that any of these pollutants have been discharged to you, you're supposed to sample the wastewater effluent form. And so, in one example I think of back in the day, if you will, is chemical toilet waste used to contain formaldehyde. Well, formaldehyde's on that Table 5 list. So technically, for the permit that has this specified in it, they were supposed to be sampling for that because they clearly knew that they were accepting chemical waste. And this also ties back into what Al was talking about, looking at hauled waste and things. The haul waste can get people in trouble pretty quick if you're not doing the proper oversight. And of course, if you are doing the oversight, you need to have the authority to regulate to enforce against them if that needs to be done, which also needs to be in the legal authority. So one of the other ones, procedures in 403.8 F2V, inspect and sample effluent from each SIU at least once a year. Of course, you can do it more frequently than that. So we're out at one industry, and the industry guy would, it was part of his job to make sure they're collecting samples, and this can apply to an independent laboratory as well. And they have a refrigerator out there, and 40 CFR Part 136 says, you got to maintain the correct temperature for samples. And so I think that's been amended now to 6 degrees centigrade, where it used to be 4 degrees. And so most people put a thermometer, and this one was in an Erlenmeyer flask. And so we looked in there and asked the guy, I said, well, how often does this refrigerator get checked? Oh, I check it every day. And here's my little checklist. And I said, well, okay. So when was the last time you checked it? Oh, I checked it this morning. Were you the one that actually checked it? Well, yeah. And so I don't know if you noticed, but the red in the thermometer, there's a separation at 14, between 14 and 16. So is that thermometer correctly reading stuff? And incidentally, that's above the 6 degrees centigrade. So there was a violation, So one of the points of the reason I put that picture in here is to don't fall victim to the checklist mentality, what I call checklist mentality, because checklists are good. It helps make sure that you're going through and you're checking on all the things that you're supposed to be checking on. But unfortunately, what a lot of people will do is like, oh, this never changes. So they'll just go up to whatever they're looking at and they'll just check it the same way it was previous. So you have to be observant. And then the other thing that'll happen is like with sampling, whether you're doing compliance monitoring or the industry's doing self-monitoring, you got to keep that tie-gun tubing clean. So these are a couple of examples where I would question the validity of the results that they're getting from the analysis of the laboratory. And so collecting samples, getting them analyzed, that's expensive. And so with these samples not being valid, that's in conflict with the 403 regs as well. So, a couple of things to look out for there. Simple, but important. Then there's usually an issue with sampling batch dischargers a lot of times people will go, oh, well, but, you know, they have it every time we go out to sample, they're not discharging. And so sometimes you have to be creative and come up with a way of you know, if they are discharging, maybe they need to notify you. And so you might want to write that in the permit of doing some sort of notification to you so many hours prior to discharging. And then that gives you the opportunity, if you choose, to go out and do some compliance monitoring. But if you do go out and try to sample, you need to document that and keep that in the file. Now here's a situation where we were asking the people. It's like, well, how do people know, you know, what not to do? And it's like, well, we train them and this, that, and the other. So, so for some reason, we kind of go back into an area that's isolated in the industry, and we see this where they're pouring paint down the drain. Well, I don't know. Could that be a slug discharge? Well, it depends on how much paint gets poured down the drain. Should they even be pouring that down the drain? I think the answer to that is probably a big no. But anyway, so just some things to look out for. And this kind of speaks to, it might be, and Al, I think you mentioned this last week, in fact, where changing out inspectors. You know, a lot of programs will assign a certain group of industries to one inspector, and they'll go out and they'll do the inspection over and over and over again. Well, it helps to sometimes have a fresh pair of eyes. So where you maybe change out inspectors periodically, or do some sort of other rotation, where you've got that fresh pair of eyes going out and looking at the industry. And like the old lady and the young girl and the American Indian and the Eskimo slide, different people see different things. So that fresh pair of eyes may help you catch some stuff before an auditor goes out there and catches it, and then all, you know, what breaks loose. So in Texas, we were kind of behind on our program reviews, so we had a number of programs that were still officially operating with regulations before the streamlining rule was promulgated in 2005. And so so you have to know which way your program is. Sometimes people would amend their program to include the streamlining stuff, but yet that hadn't been approved. Because that would, and so so that was an issue that that some programs dealt with. And where that comes into play is with the slug discharge. This is just one example, the slug discharge evaluation. So under the old regs, it had to be done in a different time frame than under the streamlining regs. And then, like during an inspection, you might go out. Here's an example a friend of mine sent me, a biodiesel thing. So the inspector, they're like standing there, and so what do you see on the floor? Yeah, that's probably that has a high potential of a slug discharge. And then voila, holy smokes, the tank's overflowing. That's definitely a slug discharge. And I don't know if you noticed. I'm going to go back a slide here. Look at the size of that pipe and the flow that's going through it, and the reducer, and the size of those tanks. So depending on the size of the pump that's feeding that system, it wouldn't be a surprise that those tanks are going to overflow. They're just under capacity. So so when you're doing site visits, you want to like at a process, you want to ask questions and stand there for a while and see kind of what happens and get an understanding of what they would expect to happen, and so that you can catch things like this. So receiving and analyzing the self-monitoring reports, this was actually quite a biggie. Remember the reports and stuff that gets submitted by the industries, those are legal documents, and they need to be reviewed in such a way as to find problems. Like, for example, if it's a company with a chain of custody that doesn't have all the information, then that sample would be considered, potentially would be considered invalid if that case ever went to court and you had to use that data. Or maybe they're not sampling for all the pollutants. And a lot of programs have a policy that if let's say the local limits are included in the permit, but if they have so many consecutive samples where it was way below the local limits, the program may waive that industry sampling for those local limits. Now, we won't get into all the nuts and bolts. That can be a very tricky proposition unless it's really specified in your approved program. And there's ways of doing that. But I would recommend at least the compliance monitoring, at least that you need to sample for all the pollutants just to make sure. Because again, remember that slide I showed earlier today, the iceberg. You know, you're only seeing stuff a couple of times a year, maybe, unless you're requiring them to sample more often, or unless you're sampling more often. So we don't know what's going on those other days when there's no oversight. No flow measurements or estimates. That's particularly important when using the combined waste stream formula and mass-based limits in the categorical standards. Because in order to get a mass, you have to have a concentration and a flow. And there are ways of justifying not actually measuring the flow, but if that's the case, then the way the flow is estimated needs to be well documented, so that if anybody's doing it, they're going to get the same result. Missing the total toxic organics or not having a toxic organic management plan, like in the current permit, you know, this would be particularly true for like metal finishers, and then there's a couple of other categorical industrial users that the TOMPs would apply to. But there's language in 403 where if they're using a TOMP plan, that needs to be specified in the permit. Same thing with the slug discharge control plan. That should be actually referenced in the permit. So here's an example of flow measurements, kind of like challenges. You know, here's like a V-notch weir, and the transducer's installed over on the left, and then you see the staff gauge just to the left of the weir, and then that diagram on the lower right-hand side shows you that the head measurement is supposed to be at least 3 to 4 times the maximum head over the V-notch weir. And so what happens is the actual the flow that's being measured by the staff gauge is going to be different than what's measured by the transducer. The transducer is located in probably a correct location, but the staff gauge is not. So when it comes time to calibrate that flow meter, there's probably going to be some issues. And a similar type of thing will apply to like inline flow measurement, where you have to have a certain distance before the flow measuring device where you get a laminar, kind of a laminar flow for some different types of flow meters. So as a pretreatment coordinator, it's important to understand what those kind of distinctions are depending on the type of flow measurement device, and to make sure that they're properly installed. So a lot of times we would see that permits were expired. The IU had a permit and they didn't renew it. Another type of thing that comes up is they didn't send in a new permit application within a prescribed period before the permit had expired, which is in the program. And that gives you an opportunity to go out and verify the permit application. I strongly recommend that if you're not doing that, that's an important thing to do. When you get a permit application, the industry may or may not have intentionally left something out of the permit, and you won't know it until you go out and actually verify the information in the permit. And yeah, we could spend the whole 8 hours on just that subject itself. Can't issue a permit for longer than 5 years. And I'd already mentioned about the slow discharge control plan. If there's a requirement for one, it should be spelled out in the permit based on your evaluation. We talked before about the sampling requirements in 40 CFR Part 136. That did get revised in 2017. I know there was a proposed rule to make another revision in 2021. I have to confess I haven't been keeping track of the progress on that. But that's one of the other things as a pretreatment coordinator. Your program, you have to keep up with the changes of rules and regulations that affect your program. And that could be the Clean Air Act, because there's actually some Clean Air Act stuff that impacts pretreatment programs for the industries that have air emissions in certain areas with VOC problems, with volatile organic chemical problems. Then there's this Part 136, electronic reporting, like Jan was talking about, and I'm really looking forward to Carrie's talk next week with EPA, Carrie Johnson. I was fortunate enough to serve on the state coordinator task force that provided input to EPA on the electronic reporting, and Carrie's a really good speaker and everything, so looking forward to that. Incorrect preservation methods and holding times. So I'd already mentioned now the new temperature is 6 degrees centigrade as opposed to 4 degrees. And so the idea is when that sample gets to the lab and the laboratory looks at the temperature of that sample, it should be at least 6 degrees centigrade. Otherwise, that sample is not, frankly, shouldn't even be analyzed. And so those are the kinds of things that you look at when you're reviewing the chain of custody, because the laboratory is going to write that kind of stuff on the chain of custody as well. And making sure that they're analyzed down to the minimum level that is specified. Al mentioned something about J flags earlier. You don't want a J flag, which means that the reporting limit was above the minimum level of detection, and which means that if there's a result that's J flag, the true result is questionable below the reporting limit. And if the local limit is below the reporting limit, then you're not really analyzing down to confirm whether or not the sample is in compliance with that local limit. I know that's kind of confusing. It's hard to explain. I'm sitting here like waving my hands, but and then not securely storing the samples. Here's one situation. This was at a hauled waste location, actually at a POTW, and in the laboratory room, See that little red circle? That's where they stored that little refrigerator is where they stored their samples, and it's unlocked. So people could tamper with those samples. And so that means the sample's not secure, which means that, again, if this went to some sort of legal, it has to be legally defensible. So that could be a problem. And then they had procedures on what type of containers that they would use to collect samples in, and so there were some issues with that where they weren't doing what they were supposed to be. So that wasn't good. And then we're almost done here. Procedures to, all the stuff that's supposed to be in permits. Al has already talked about some of those things. Not categorizing a CIU correctly. What happens there is you have these dates that if an industry was in operation before a certain date, they would be an existing source. But then if they made some sort of change after that date in their process, they would become a new source. And in the pretreatment regulations for categorical industrial users, there's the pretreatment limits for new sources and pretreatment limits for existing sources. And sometimes those are different. So you have to make sure that you've identified that. There can be a lot of errors using the combined waste stream formula. There's like about 10 or 12 things that have to be in place, if you will, in order for the combined waste stream formula to be used. Otherwise, the industry would have to make some modifications to be able to sample at the end of process. And that can be very expensive for some industries. So I wouldn't want to be the pretreatment coordinator that would have to shed that news to the industry, because then you'll probably have city management and or board of directors of the city council be getting involved in those types of things. So randomly sample and analyze the effluent to identify independent information. Al had mentioned that. And so a friend of mine years ago, he's passed away. He was working at a large utility in North Texas. And this is what he found one day when he got to work. That's kind of a classic interference. It looks like a laundromat where you might have dumped a package of some kind of detergent or whatever. And so when you get those types of situation, that's when you have to put on that investigation hat and try to figure out what was going on. Of course, that would be, well, I've seen plant startups and have been involved in a plant startup where there's a lot of foam and everything, but nothing like that. And then industries that claim they're not discharging any processed wastewater, that may be true whenever they get their permit, but through your inspection process and the process where they are turning in their the self-monitoring reports, they have a little certification statement that they're still not discharging any processed wastewater, and then you can verify that during the inspection. And last but not least, I think Al covered this adequately. Basically, it's like CA, where they're issuing basically the same violations without a compliance schedule. That's a problem. Or they repeatedly extend the compliance schedule. That's a problem. They don't escalate enforcement. And like we've mentioned before, SNC is not escalated enforcement. So Here's a document. If you haven't seen this before, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's actually one of the newer EPA documents, the 2017, and it really does have a lot of good information in it. And I know I put together a training program for a bunch of programs in North Texas, and we kind of used this. It was something that they could dig deeper into, and they found it very useful. And the EPA pretreatment facility inspector videos that Sacramento State College did, they're a little dated, like 1998. And I understand they're in the process of maybe updating those, but that was just before COVID hit, so I'm not too sure what the timeline is now. And there's some information in those videos, some of the messaging that's a little dated and not quite accurate today. But I think these cost like about $100. And so as far as a training tool to help get your folks on the same page, this may be something you want to look into. And I know a number of I've been told a number of pretreatment programs, some of the bigger programs across the country, they've kind of put together their own set of training tools and things. So, but anyway, and so there's that one question I need to answer. But like in summary, again, you got to know your program, know the regs, have training, try to switch people out, assigning different tasks to them so that they become familiar with the whole program. And let's see, what I want to do now is quickly show you a document. And if I can find I can't find my cursor. Does anybody see my cursor? It's disappeared.
Not unless you got two screens, do you?
Yeah, and I'm looking at both.
I don't see it on this end.
Okay. To answer the question about resources and funding, 1983, EPA published their new program development guidance, and I realized that 83, well, that's a long time ago. It's almost 40 years. However, back in the back, I think it's chapter 7. I had it pulled up that I was going to show you, but it walks you through some of the tasks and things that you have to consider in order to put together funding, and actually shows you some example calculations. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you turned in your program for approval to the state or EPA, depending on who was your approval authority, funding and resources had to be submitted with that. So there's somewhere, if you can put your hands on it, should be the basis for those calculations. And another source to go to would be the pretreatment coordinators listserv that was being discussed earlier.
David, it looks like if you look on your slide right now, on slide 35, that might be your cursor right there. Yeah. Yeah,
I see it. It has. There must be something going on in the background. I've lost control of it. But anyway, and I think Andrea was talking about the pretreatment listserv. So you can always post questions on that, and they also have, if you become a member of that, they have some resources that you don't see in the emails that you can go to. And those questions have been asked quite a bit over the years. So with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to you guys. I appreciate again the opportunity, and hope you might have picked up something.
David, we did have one last question, if you are open to spending just one more minute with us.
Sure.
Someone wanted to get insight from you on how, he says, how do you get away from seeing J flags. And so I know we're running a little bit over, but if you wanted to briefly answer the question.
You have to have a conversation with the laboratory. When in 2017, with those changes, the regulations changed somewhat so that their minimum detection levels on a number of pollutants went down, and which means there's an impact on the minimum levels that EPA uses to determine compliance. And your state may also have their own minimum levels. Like in Texas, we call them a minimum allowable levels, MALs. But anyway, and so you have to have a conversation with your lab, because there are many laboratories that have claimed that they can't meet these lower levels because, as it turns out, they don't want to invest in the equipment or the changes that they need to make. That's not an accusatory statement. That's just kind of the way it is. Or they may not be using a good technique, or there may be some type of interference that's occurring in the sample that they have to take care of. So that's the real short answer of a good question. But yeah, go to the lab and work it and try to work it out with them.
Thank you, David.
Can we take the poll question real quick?
Let's do the poll.
And I promise the last one will be serious. This one's poll question is, having established David James' Klingon roots, what gave it away? His use of Klingon slang? His bat'leth hanging on the wall behind him? His forehead? All of the above or none of the above? And
Ken, you're going to owe me 2 drinks for that.
fair enough.
No, I'm just kidding. I love your sense of humor. That's great.
So we're getting up there. Let's give it about 10 more seconds so we can move along to Martina. And we'll go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I am closing the poll. And it looks, David, like all of the above is the clear winner.
Thanks, everybody.
So I probably owe you 3 drinks now.
Okay.
All right, back to you, Andrea.
Have a great day.
Great, thank you so much. And hopefully everybody was able to participate in the poll that time. I think we did have a couple issues. Let us know if you weren't able to take the poll, and we can make the correction on our end, but you will have to reach out to us to let us know. Let's see, we are at our final presentation for the day. We're going to go ahead and roll into this rather than taking a break, just so we can be mindful of everyone's time and so that we can wrap up today's workshop. So good morning, well, I guess good afternoon now for everyone on here. I don't know that we have anyone attending today from Hawaii, but so good afternoon, Martina. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ms. Nelson is joining us as a representative of the Minnesota Metropolitan Council Environmental Services. So it looks like you're with the Industrial Waste and Pollution Prevention section.
Correct. Yep. And I am from Minneapolis, St. Paul. So
great.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
No, are you going to pass control to me, or?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and pass controls over to you. You'll get a pop-up asking you to share your screen, but I'll pass it along to you. Again, welcome, and thank you for being so generous with your time today.
All right, hold on though. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
There you go. Yep.
All right.
Perfect.
All right, so as Andrea said, my name is Tina Nelson, or Martina Nelson. I'm the Industrial Waste Manager for Industrial Waste and Pollution Prevention section. at Metropolitan Council Environmental Services in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Quite a mouthful. So I had hoped to go into the office today because I have way better internet there. So I'm probably going to turn my camera off just to make sure I don't have any technical difficulties, if you guys don't mind. But I wanted to thank you for this opportunity to join you this year. I've really enjoyed all the presentations I've been able to attend so far, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit about my organization and our dental amalgam program with you. Can you just see my presentation, or?
We can see you as well.
Oh, okay. Oh, maybe the camera's not going to go off. All right.
There is an icon on the control bar to your right-hand side.
Okay. All right.
There you go.
Okay. Maybe I was in the wrong screen. Okay, here we go. All right. So I am from Minnesota, born and raised. I left briefly to attend college in Michigan, but then came back to my home state to start my career protecting the environment. So I did a Google search. What is Minnesota known for? So a few things. We are the land of 10,000 lakes. We have the headworks of the Mississippi River, and our two largest cities, where I live, Minneapolis and St. Paul, reside on those river banks. And culturally, we are known for the late musician Prince, the delicious Juicy Lucy, and of course, our charming accents from the movie Fargo. All right. So today I just kind of wanted to share a little bit about my organization and section with you and our role in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And then I'll cover the history and the impact of our dental amalgam program on our region. I wanted to cover current statistics of our program and how we are using technology and systems to manage it. And then I'll share a little bit about our pilot dental inspection program and the impacts of that we conducted in 2017. And then to end, I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that are facing our program and some of the things that we're thinking about taking on in the future to address those challenges and improve our program. All right, so in the 1960s, our Minnesota State Legislature established what we call the Metropolitan Council. We are a regional body that serves three main functions. We have a community development division that supports our cities and townships to be prosperous and resilient by guiding them in developing comprehensive long-range plans. We have a transit division that connects people to places and keeps the economy moving by operating a regional transit system that includes buses and both light and commuter rail. And finally, we have an environmental services division, which is my division, and we protect the waterways and parklands to sustain our environment. All right, so within environmental services, we have three key roles. We operate a wastewater system for our region, which includes 111 cities and townships and over 2.7 million residents. We do this by operating 9 wastewater treatment plants and 640 miles of interceptors, and we treat over 250 million gallons of wastewater each day. We also monitor air and water quality throughout the region, which helps to protect our environment as well as public health and safety. Lastly, we plan for long-range water supply to meet future demand and foster economic growth in our region. MCES has over 600 people, $7 billion in assets, and a very robust annual capital improvement program. So as I said, I manage the industrial waste section, and we administer a federally delegated pretreatment program here in Minnesota. We regulate and monitor industrial dischargers in our area, and then we work closely with other business units to protect our wastewater treatment plants and our collection system. We also respond to sewer-related spills and community issues like fog and prohibited waste discharge. We have a fairly large pretreatment program, the largest in Minnesota. There is a staff of 30 people. We've got 229 SIUs and about 300 other facilities we permit under a standard discharge permit based on volume and wastewater discharge characteristics. We have a special discharge program where we permit contaminated groundwater, landfill leachate, and industrial waste that is hauled to us from outside of our service area. We also permit liquid waste haulers for several different hauled waste types. And then we have developed 5 different general permit types. We permit microbreweries, hospitals, water treatment plants, zero discharge categorical industrial users, and sewer cleaning waste haulers, or what we like to call Vector trucks. Lastly, we have over 850 dental clinics that are enrolled in our amalgam recovery program. So today I was asked to talk to you about our dental amalgam program, and we began in the 1990s. So during that time in the early 90s, we faced more stringent mercury limits for our effluent and our air emissions. And data showed that mercury was high in our collection system, and it was present in all areas, not just hotspots. So we embarked on a major point source investigation to determine the source of mercury in our collection system. Our research in collaboration with professors, both in the United States and abroad, suggested that dental clinics might be a large point source of mercury for us. Our organization is very customer service and partnership focused. So we started working with the Minnesota Dental Association in 1998 to evaluate the feasibility of having an amalgam recovery program. So we started that partnership slowly. We began conducting sampling of dental wastewater, and we found that the average mercury loading from a clinic was 234 milligrams per day. And this translated into about 80% of our influent mercury coming from dental clinics. So we continued with that partnership in 2001 and conducted a removal study in 2 service areas that did not have any known industrial sources of mercury. So for the first study, we installed separators for 3 months at all 6 dental clinics in our Hastings service area. Sampling was conducted downstream of the separators and at our wastewater treatment plant. And we calculated that the removal efficiency, or we calculated a 44% reduction in the influent mercury at that plant. We then moved on to our Cottage Grove service area and conducted another study for 3 months. For this study, 6 out of 7 dentists partnered with us, and the mercury reduction was measured to be 29% in the influent. In both studies, we took a look at the removal efficiency of the separators used and measured that at anywhere from 91 to 99%. So it was a successful study, and based on that information, we developed a list of approved separators with the Minnesota Dental Association in 2003. And continuing on in that partnership with MDA, we developed a voluntary amalgam recovery program. So clinics that installed an approved separator and agreed to follow best management practices received a variance from our local limit for mercury, which was 2 micrograms per liter and still is. Those clinics were then issued a certificate of compliance that is effective for 5 years, and they could display for their patients. Clinics that did not choose to enroll in our program, we proposed that they would be issued a permit, they would need to pay an annual permit fee, and then would be required to sample and meet the local limit for mercury, which they obviously could not. So in reality, our program was not voluntary, and to date, but I mean, it has worked, it's been very successful, and to date, we have never had to issue a discharge permit to a dental clinic. And since the beginning, our dental clinics have not had to pay an annual fee to be in the program, so it's a pretty good deal for them. and for us. So over time, we've been able to measure the impact of this program on our region. We have seen a cumulative 67% reduction, remember that number, in the influent mercury loading at our largest plant. This program has negated the need for some additional effluent limits, and it has helped us meet more stringent air limits at our wastewater treatment plants. It has also meant that we haven't had to lower our local limit for mercury for the rest of our industrial users. And for the past few years, we have entered into a partnership with the University of Minnesota. We're trying to explore a beneficial reuse of our ash in fertilizer. So while this project was made, mostly or largely possible just because of the success of the pretreatment program in general, which has lowered our regulated metals in our influent by over 90%. But if you think about it, mercury is typically not part of an EPA category as a regulated metal. So the amalgam recovery program can also be recognized as a reason why we have been able to explore a beneficial use of our ash. All right, so we've had our partnership with the Minnesota Dental Association, and we've also developed one with our control authority, which is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So the MPCA developed their own statewide program in 2010, and they looked at our list and kind of developed their own as well. So in 2012, we entered into a more formal partnership with the MPCA to ensure that there was a consistent approach to dental clinics throughout our state, and they took ownership of that list. So we continued to partner with them, and we helped them update the list of approved separators as needed. And I did want to point out that our required efficiency rate capture for Minnesota is 99%, which is more stringent than the federal requirement. So currently we have over 850 active dental clinics participating in our program. 20% of these clinics are what I would call a chain or a corporation, and they have a dedicated environmental compliance representative. These clinics are generally pretty easy to work with. The remaining 80% are individual practices or partnerships, many of which have 2 to 4 locations throughout our metropolitan area. Only 4% of our clinics are endodontics, which we did add to our program after the EPA rule was promulgated. They were originally exempt. And all other specialty clinics are exempt from our program currently. So our current enrollment of 850 is down from a pre-pandemic high of 891. We've found that COVID has resulted in some closures due to economics and early retirements. And we have also recognized the need to actively look for changes in clinic ownership, not just because of COVID, but lots of ownership changes happened before. And we hadn't done this for several years before the EPA dental rule was promulgated. So every year we request through the Data Practices Act an active list of dental clinics from the Minnesota Department of Health. So the Department of Health is tracking each dental clinic through an X-ray registry identification number. And we have added that ID to our database so that we can easily identify new and closed clinics as well as name changes. So we did start this in 2019, and it resulted that year in 250 new clinics to our program. And that was a huge undertaking to get them all enrolled. So we have made this an annual task to compare the lists so we can stay on top of who needs to be in our program. So our program has always had a requirement for an annual certification statement, and that has not changed even though the EPA rule only requires that a dental clinic submit a one-time compliance report. And all of our clinics are required to submit their annual certification statement using our EPA Cromer approved electronic reporting system. Their statements become available in June or on June 1st, and they're due on June 30th. So our form satisfies all of the EPA rule requirements. And then we're just trying to make sure that we're keeping up to date with their contact information and their operational information, and that they're updating and verifying the make, model, and serial number of their separator that is installed. At submittal, they are certifying that they are following best management practices for operating and maintaining their separator, as well as managing amalgam and other dental clinic wastes. So this is what our annual certification statement looks like online in our system. And at the end of the presentation, if anybody wants me to go into the system and so you can take a look, I can do that. Pretty much all of these questions are required, with the exception of the very last question where we ask if they have any concerns or comments on the operation of their separator. And many of these fields do have validation on them to make sure that they are entering sensical data into the system. So for example, the number of operatories where amalgam is placed must be a number. So after all these questions are answered, the system checks for validation, and then the submitter checks that certification statement and enters their security question or their security questions to submit it, which is a CROMAIR requirement. After each successful submission, the submitter receives an email with a PDF copy of their completed annual certification statement. A copy is always available in our system for download or printing. And once they submit it, we get notification, and our dental lead goes in and approves each submittal, which transfers all of that data into the database, as well as that same PDF copy is attached. We are also using our online reporting system to issue and reissue certificates of compliance to our dental clinics every 5 years. So they need to log into the system, and they can press that little PDF printer icon there in the permits and license section, and their certificate pops up in a window and they can print it. So when we started using our online reporting system for dental clinics in 2016, before the dental rule went into effect. And when it did, we needed to upload our form to make sure that our form met the requirements of the one-time compliance report, because we did not want to have two forms. So we worked with our vendor to add 9 new questions to our original certification statement. The additional data we needed to capture surrounded around ownership and location changes. We needed information on their inspection and record keeping requirements. We needed to add a question about whether or not a bypass had occurred since the last statement submittal, and whether or not they were using any third parties to help them maintain their separator. So over the years, we have made many enhancements to our systems to make the administration of our amalgam recovery program more efficient, especially in light of the fact that we don't charge them an annual fee. So each of our clinics has a permit record in our database, and we added some functionality so that we can kind of mass renew all of our dental clinic certificates once every 5 years. So that has saved us administratively, and that carried a very low cost of about $3,300. And we've used the functionality twice now, and we'll be using it again in 2023 during our next renewal. When our electronic reporting system went live, it cost us $6,300 to develop the original online form and the integration of the data back and forth with our database. We enhanced that form in 2018 to add those 9 additional questions. And then again in 2018 was the original one. And then in 2019, we added that Department of Health X-ray registry ID. And those 2 enhancements carried a cost of just over $10,000. So keeping in mind that they don't pay an annual fee, these expenses have resulted in a significant cost savings for a program that currently doesn't have any cost recovery. So before we had online submittal, we would receive paper statements and our admin would need to enter all of the data into our database and then scan and attach a copy to the system as well. And then we're also saving money by sending certificates into the online system. Before we used to print them out in color on really nice fancy paper and then mail them out to all the clinics. So conservatively, in a conservative estimate, I calculate that we're saving about $6,800 per year for what we have invested in system enhancements for this program. So while online submittal is a great administrative benefit, in some ways, it can be a large challenge. But the challenge of online submittal for dental clinics mirrors that that faces all of the permittees who use our system. Our system is mandatory for all of our permittees. Online, enrollment in our system can be very, very slow. We do not allow for shared accounts, and there's a lot of turnover at some dental clinics. So this might mean that a dental clinic is signing up a new user each and every year just to submit their annual statement. And because our system is Cromer approved, all users who want to sign and submit something need to fill out an electronic signature agreement. It can be challenging to get a clinic to submit that agreement correctly, and we cannot turn on their account permissions until they do. And then there's a lot of confusion. Some of them think that the electronic signature agreement is their annual certification statement, not just a step to be able to access the form online. Generally, most clinics are good to work with, but some have been very challenging to get enrolled in using the system. Dental clinics are using our system only once per year to submit their annual statement. So infrequent use means a lot of locked out accounts. So June and July are very busy for our our online support team, and many users need assistance to reset their password PIN and security questions and answers. Lastly, many users log into the system and they will fill out all of the information in the form, but they don't actually certify, sign, and submit it, even though they think they did. So it can be challenging to explain that to a user, and then it takes time to guide them over the phone to make sure that they complete the entire submittal. So I had heard in a previous presentation, I think it was one day last week, these are all of the reasons why EPA is reviewing Cromer applications and the implementation plans, just to make sure that your pretreatment program has adequate resources to support online reporting for all of your industrial users. So we've had a program for quite some time, and we had wanted to start an inspection program for many years. So we finally decided to do that in 2017. We had a pilot inspection program, and our main goal was to evaluate the integrity of our amalgam recovery program. Inspecting separators in the field would allow us to verify that the clinics were installing, operating, and maintaining their separators properly, and that they were following best management practices for handling amalgam and other dental clinic wastes. We also had a sense that our dental clinics needed some educational resources. So inspections would help us determine what those resources were and how to develop and distribute them to the dental clinics. And then finally, we wanted to know, was there a need to develop an ongoing dental inspection program for our region? So at the time in 2017, we had 2 dental program leads, and they trained 2 of our sampling technicians on how amalgam separators should be installed, operated, and maintained. We also developed an inspection checklist for consistency in inspection among our staff when out in the field. And then we leveraged our partnership with the Minnesota Dental Association to help communicate the existence, purpose, and importance of our pilot inspection program to the dental clinics. In an effort to keep things light, we did refer to inspections as site checks when we scheduled them. Over a 2-month period, we conducted 34 site checks across the Twin Cities. We tried to disperse them among our 7 counties just to see if their interactions with county or city officials had any impact on how they operated and maintained their separator. We also tried to make sure that we were inspecting a variety of separator models so that we could develop help sheets for each one. So we learned a lot from our pilot study. We learned that separators collect all solids, not just amalgam, so frequent maintenance truly is needed. We also learned that see-through containers can darken over time, which can make visual inspection more difficult. We confirmed that if a clinic does not properly maintain their separator, they are likely lowering their removal efficiency or jeopardizing some clogging or bypass issues. We witnessed evidence that not all cleaners are appropriate in terms of pH and oxidizing potential and should not be present in amalgam containing wastewater. And most importantly, we learned that our dental clinics need and appreciate assistance in understanding how to operate and maintain their separators. We found many issues like installations that were backward or chemicals that they were using that were rendering the separator ineffective. And these were all brought up to the dental clinics, and they were genuinely appreciative of the feedback and committed to resolving those issues. So based on the success and findings of the pilot study, we did move forward with implementing an ongoing dental inspection program in 2019. Our goal was to inspect 20% of our clinics each year, or once per certificate cycle. We had an intern in 2019, Alejandro, and he was dedicated to conducting dental inspections, and we even extended him part-time through the school year so that he could continue his work. He focused on inspecting clinics that are continuously late in submitting their annual certification statements so that we could gain a greater presence with them. And he actually helped shag in some of those late statements when he was out doing inspections. Alejandro completed 134 inspections in 2019 and early 2020 until the pandemic halted all of our operations. So Alejandro also worked on our with our dental program lead to develop help sheets for each approved separator model based on manufacturer guidelines and what we observed in the field. All the help sheets were then to be posted on a dedicated website that we had committed to creating for our dental clinics. And then we kept up our partnership with the Minnesota Dental Association to stay visible and to improve our communications with dental clinics. So again, we have not inspected any dental clinics since the pandemic started, and we hope to resume them in 2022 because we truly believe that they need a periodic refresher to make sure that they are operating and maintaining their separator correctly. So over time, we have learned, not just for dental clinics, but for all industrial users, it is really important to have one place to house all information that they need to know to comply with our program. Our dental clinics, are no exception. So a couple of years ago, we developed a dedicated website for them. On our website, they can easily find everything they need to know, from a list of approved separators to a YouTube video that shows them step-by-step how to complete their annual certification statement online. We have also provided an example log for recording their weekly inspection and maintenance activities. So this URL is included on every communication to our clinics, and we have received great feedback and appreciation from them for having the resource available. So as I said, we are facing some big challenges with this program. Obviously, the biggest one is communication. We're only interacting with them once a year, and there is high turnover in this industry, especially with the people we are connecting with. And many of these dental clinics forget about us and forget that they have an annual statement due. And even with a dedicated website and routine email reminders, as my dental lead Nam says, people are people. Information is available, but not everyone takes the time to really read and understand it. So to meet this challenge, we plan to keep publishing content in routine newsletters that are sent to the dental clinics from the Dental Association, hoping to stay visible and keep pushing our message out to them. One other big challenge we have is trying to reduce the number of late annual statement submittals. So, nearly 20 years later, we realize there are some limitations of a voluntary program in terms of enforcing the submittal of the annual certification statement. And while we do have the authority to enforce this, we are very sensitive to our partnership with the Minnesota Dental Association, and we value that partnership. But we do believe that some program changes are needed, especially now that the EPA dental rule is in effect. So typically on any given year, only 60% of our clinics are submitting their statement on time, and then our dental lead is spending months chasing the rest of them. So for the statement that is due June 30th, we still have about 5% that we need to chase, although some of these clinics could be closed due to COVID. So one of the things that we want to do in the future is to explore the development and implementation of a general permit for dental clinics that would replace the certificate of compliance, that it wouldn't change their annual reporting requirements, and they would still receive the variance and not be required to sample. And due to the complexity of collecting annual permit fees from 850 dental clinics, because our online reporting system isn't set up to take payment, I do think that this general permit fee, or this general permit, would likely not carry a fee. However, it would allow us to leverage general permit conditions more directly so that we could issue late report enforcement actions to dental clinics that are grossly overdue in submitting their annual certification statement. So then we would assess them a fee, which would hopefully increase the percentage of clinics that are submitting on time each year and lessen the number that we need to chase and the length of time that we're chasing. All right, and in the future, now that we have our 2021 annual certification statements mostly in, we are due to compare our list with the Department of Health to ensure that all clinics are enrolled in our program. This process will also help us verify some of the closures that have happened over the past 18 months. Finally, we do want to resume our ongoing dental inspection program in 2022. We will again focus on clinics that are late in submitting their annual certification statement. We also think it's important to inspect new clinics so we can establish a relationship with them and educate them in person on our program and its requirements. And finally, we will focus on clinics in service areas with where we are observing higher influent mercury again at the receiving wastewater treatment plant. We identified 3 such areas during the local limit study we just completed this past September. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions and comments anyone has.
Hey, Tina, this is Patrick. We did have a question regarding the separator, a list of separators that you use, but it looked like your slide, what is that, like maybe slide 23, had that website where folks can get that information. Would that be correct?
Yep, I can go to the website here.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
So this is the dedicated website we have developed for our dental offices, and it's pretty clean and straightforward. And let's see.
Right there.
So here's the link to the approved separator. So it does redirect them to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency page.
Okay.
And the list of separators is here.
There you go. Hope that helps, Dale.
Do you want me to put the link in the chat?
Yeah, I think he's probably not the only one that would like that information. Thanks, Tina.
We also have a question. I'm going to go ahead and read it. It says, so I guess there's some insight. It says, make sure you talk to clinics about not putting chairside traps into the red bags. Instead, have them put in the dedicated hazardous waste receptacles.
Yeah.
Is that something you run into, Tina, at all?
I'm sure that it has. I mean, I have not conducted these inspections myself, but here is the BMPs that we have for our clinics.
Okay.
And so they are listed out. This is something that would translate into a general permit that, we would have a general permit conditions, and then we'd have a best management practices section, like we do for our other general permit types.
I think what he may be referring to is the biohazard bags versus hazardous waste disposal.
Sure.
How many full-time staff members implement this program, Tina?
Currently, we have one. Well, he's not full-time dental, so we have one permit engineer that is our dental clinic lead, and so he's spending a lot of his time on this half of the year, not so much the other half, due to when the statement is due. And then we do have 2 technicians that are trained to help do site checks or inspections in the field. So again, if we're doing, the goal is to inspect our dental clinics once every 5 years. So they wouldn't, I don't know that we have even a full FTE on it when you add in all the time of NOG's time plus the time that's out in the field. I mean, maybe one combined, but we don't have any truly dedicated 100% to dental staff.
Okay. Well, that was a lot of really good information. We had a couple people wanting to express gratitude for your willingness to come and share with us. The information you shared was very valuable, and especially the inclusion of photos on what to expect. So yeah, thank you so much. Here's Ms. Nelson's contact information. So if anyone has any more questions for her or needs to reach out, it's posted here.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, or you can reach out to our dental program lead, Nam Buckingholtz. His information is there too.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us. I think Ken is going to go ahead and open the poll for those of you who are wanting to participate and get CEUs for attendance.
Okay, last poll of the day. And it reads a little funny on the screen because my characters were limited, but since the inception of MCEs has been the cumulative reduction in the influent mercury loading to its largest treatment plant. Please select one, and she gave you a big clue during the presentation. 25, 40, 67, or 95%. So we'll give it about 10 more seconds here. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm closing the poll, and it looks like 63% of you caught that little hint or were paying very close attention. You all get CEU credit for this, but 63% of you got the right answer. It was 67%. So thank you, Martina. And back to you, Andrea.
Okay. Thanks for posting the poll, Ken. I'm sharing our, let's see, I think I'm sharing the final slide here. Let's see. I'm not sure if we see the final
Thank
slide.
you.
I see screen, it's not asking me to allow images, but let's see. What are you seeing on the screen, Patrick?
I see the 2021 PNPW Pretreatment Workshop. Oops.
I gotcha.
There it is. Okay, now I'm seeing your screen.
I see. Oh, there it is. Okay. Sorry for that, folks. Go ahead and just share this. The final slide, you know, we just wanted to thank everyone for coming today. We do have a few minutes extra before the end of the hour. So I just wanted to remind everyone that if you wanted to join the pretreatment community through the pretreatment coordinators group, please email Gene Bennett. I believe we posted his email address in the chat boxes. If you didn't get it, feel free to reach out to one of the moderators, someone from this group, and we'll get it to you. Let's see, we will be continuing the workshop tomorrow on Wednesday, November 10th. It's the 4th day of the workshop. And I don't know about you, Patrick, but I feel like this is a pretty informative day. A lot of information to unpack.
You know, there was a lot of good information talked about today. I think everybody benefited from attending. You know, and like you're saying, don't forget we got 2 more days to go. That's tomorrow and next week, correct?
Yep, tomorrow and next Tuesday. So thanks everyone again for participating today, and
Thank you very much.
tomorrow morning.